She was a refugee, making a name for herself in the U.S.
She was born in Cuba. She wanted to be an artist. She wanted to be somebody.
And she finally met a man that felt like home.
He was also an immigrant. That was the common bond the two of them had.
She begins to fall for this guy. The stars begin to twinkle.
But when torrential rains reveal a horrific crime, the entire community is put on high alert.
The body had been mutilated and burned in that stream.
It almost looked like an autopsy left undone.
This was obviously not a run-of-the-mill murder.
We had some kind of cycle on our hands.
When two suspects implicate one another, the cards of fate send investigators spiraling down a dark and twisted trail.
He made the police really creeped out.
He believes that he can read minds and that he can control people.
This wasn't a man that she was dealing with. This was a devil.
There was blood splatter all over the walls.
He was cool. He was collected. He was a killer.
Just 30 miles north of Midtown Manhattan lies the village of Spring Valley, a diverse suburb divided between Ramapo and Clarkstown, New York.
Spring Valley historically was a resort town and beautiful area, mountains, trees, rivers.
It's a big mixture of different communities that do get along together very well. In particular, within the Hispanic community.
In the summer of 1998, Spring Valley had been hit with a torrential rainfall as part of an unusual weather phenomenon crossing the country.
At that period of time, the U.S. was under the influence of El Nino. And what that meant for our area here in the Northeast was rain, rain, rain.
Our parks was flooded, our streets, people complaining about their yards, their houses being flooded.
But by Monday, June 13th, the rain has finally subsided.
A local resident went out to inspect the water levels in the creek in his backyard.
He was checking the drainage because, all the rain that they've been having.
Whenever there's rain and stuff, he gets a little flooding, and because of El Nino, it was a lot more rain.
However, when the man reaches the edge of the creek, he notices something unsettling.
It looked like a body wrapped in some sort of plastic.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
And horrified, he immediately ran to the phone, called 911, and said, "I think you need to get here now."
Investigators quickly respond to the man's home.
It's back here.
I was led to the backyard of the caller that called it in. The body appeared to be wrapped in some kind of plastic and set on fire, and it was already decomposing. I knew that this was going to be a very difficult case to even start to put together.
There was no trace evidence, nothing you might expect at a typical crime scene.
The police were able to at least ascertain that it appeared to be a young Hispanic woman, probably in her early 20s.
Investigators hope fingerprints will help ID their victim. But they're soon hit with a horrific realization.
There's no hands.
They're gone?
To my shock, the hands on this body were missing. They were actually hacked off.
This was something that really took them back.
I'm realizing that based on the hands being cut off and the body being set on fire, that this was done to try and prevent us from identifying who this person was.
The detectives didn't have a hand, let alone a print. So they had to call the medical examiner.
After the medical examiner removes the burned plastic, he discovers even more horrifying details.
Not only are her hands severed, she was disemboweled as well.
But regardless of the body's condition, the medical examiner is able to ascertain the cause of death.
massive blunt force trauma to the head.
This lady was brutally murdered with some kind of foreign object, maybe a sledgehammer.
They believe those blows to the head probably caused instant death, which is good because the severing of the hands, the mutilating of the body were most likely done post-mortem, so she didn't have to suffer through that.
Unfortunately, a large part of her face is indistinguishable, so they are still unable to identify her.
We really had nothing to go on, but luckily I've worked with this awesome officer from Clarkstown who is also a sketch artist. So I immediately contacted him.
He was able to duplicate one side of the face to match the other side of the face so that you now had a face in its entirety.
This sketch was then put to all the newspapers and television stations in the New York tri-state area.
And before long, they get a call from a local man named Stanley Ellis.
Anderson.
Hi. I'm calling about the girl in the newspaper.
He immediately recognized the sketch, particularly the gap in the teeth.
It was his missing friend, 20-year-old Beatrice Alvarez.
He said that was my friend Beatrice. I hadn't seen her in over a month. I wondered what happened to her.
On the cusp of adulthood, Beatrice Alvarez had already experienced more than many people do in a lifetime.
She was a refugee from Havana, Cuba. She endured many trials along the way, but she was resilient.
Her and her family, they ended up in Queens.
But like many hoping to achieve the American dream, the obstacles they faced proved to be insurmountable.
They did fall on hard times, and unfortunately it broke the family up. The brother and the sister, they moved away. The mother ended up, I believe, in a homeless shelter.
Although she did come from this background where her family struggled, Beatrice did not let that stop her.
She became a hairdresser to earn a living. She was talented in that way.
Anybody that she came in contact with instantly fell in love with her because she just had that charming personality.
She always had a smile. She was always upbeat. She was always determined.
But doing hair wasn't Beatrice's true passion.
She liked to do hair as a profession, but her heart and soul was really much into the fine arts and she wanted to be an artist.
One of her prized possessions was her sketch pad, and she took it with her everywhere she went.
She wanted to be somebody. She wanted to live the artist life.
She was trying to aspire to reach the American dream.
Having spent much of her life alone, Beatrice also yearned for companionship. And during the spring of 1998, she thought she'd found just that in local shop owner Felipe Rivera.
Hey.
Hi.
How was work?
It was good. A little slow, but it gave me time to work on my sketches.
She is in love with him and is ready to start this life with him. However, she then meets his friend, Vinicio.
Hola, Felipe.
Vinicio.
Vinicio walks in, and that's all that she can see.
Hey, Vinicio, this is my girl, Beatrice.
Nice to meet you, Beatrice.
Nice to meet you.
You two want to grab some lunch today?
Ah, man, I can't. I have to stay behind and man the store.
Felipe encouraged her to go get lunch with Vinicio.
Hey, you two be good.
They decide to go out for lunch together, and that was it. She's totally into this guy.
It was one moment where they were actually alone together, just talking and getting to know each other, and sparks started to fly.
These are amazing.
Thank you. I want to be an artist full time, but city can be a lot, you know?
Trust me, I get it.
Vinicio was also an immigrant. He came from South America, and that was the common bond the two of them had. He's 32, and he seems to have this stuff together. He's got his own place. He's got a job, a good job, too.
Vinicio was working at a military manufacturer.
It's not easy to survive here, but hard work and determination will get you a long way.
You think so? Feels kind of hopeless sometimes.
I won't let you give up. You got real talent, B.
She opens up herself to a situation where she begins to fall for this guy. The stars begin to twinkle. It's always that, for lack of a better term, that apple in the garden, that forbidden fruit.
Listen, I've actually got some connections. I think I could help you.
Really?
Yeah.
That'd be amazing.
Ultimately, Beatrice decided that she would leave her boyfriend and go live with Vinicio Valverde.
But now, after receiving a call from her friend, Stanley Ellis, detectives believe Beatrice Alvarez is the woman found brutally murdered and dismembered in a local creek.
Yeah, that sketch looks exactly like her.
Her hands had been cut off, and she had been disemboweled, burned.
Very dangerous, maybe deranged person that will go to these kind of extremes. We had some kind of cycle on our hands.
20-year-old Beatrice Alvarez was an artist chasing her dreams when she fell in love with 32-year-old Vinicio Valverde.
They felt they had the same likes, and it was their life stories were about the same, how they immigrated from another country to come here for a better life.
Beatrice believes that she has found her soulmate, her match. This is the man that is going to help her really build that American dream.
But now Beatrice's promising future hangs in the balance.
Her friend believes she was the woman police found, burned and dismembered in her local creek.
It's one thing to kill a person. It's another thing to cut their stomach open and then cut off their hand. That speaks to a sociopath.
When was the last time you saw Beatrice?
It's been a few weeks.
He said they knew each other from working at the salon and used to talk and hang out quite often.
Then one day, Beatrice was gone.
It was really just quite sudden. One day she just doesn't show up and never showed up again.
I don't see her for weeks. And then her boyfriend shows up for a haircut appointment.
Hey, Stanley.
Hey, have you seen Beatrice?
He says, what's going on? Is she okay?
Stanley says he was surprised by what Vinicio said next.
She left me for another guy.
He just casually says, well, one night she got into a car with a musician and drove off.
A musician?
Yeah. I don't know his name, but she left me for him.
Did he say where they went?
Nope. He didn't give me any other details.
After speaking with Stanley, investigators are able to confirm his hunch about his missing friend.
Rockland County was very fortunate to have a brilliant medical examiner.
Once they had a name, they were able to use DNA evidence to confirm her identity. They were certain Beatrice was their deceased victim.
But when they attempt to deliver the tragic news to Beatrice's next of kin, detectives hit a wall.
I did everything I could to reach out to the mother, but unfortunately, due to her being homeless, I couldn't locate her.
As Beatrice's family had been dispersed, really, across the country, it was very difficult to track down the next of kin.
Thanks.
But eventually, the brother called, and I actually spoke to him on the phone, and he was informed that his sister was killed. Unfortunately, during my career, I've made too many death notifications, and no matter how many you do, it does not get easier. And this was probably one of the worst ones that I had to do, because not only did I have to make a notification that a loved one was dead, but they were brutally murdered.
Beatrice's brother has no idea who would want to do this to his sister.
The distance had made it hard to keep in touch. He didn't know anything about who Beatrice was living with, who her friends were, nothing.
Detectives are eager to speak with Beatrice's ex-boyfriend, Vinicio Valverde, about the mysterious musician she supposedly ran off with prior to her disappearance.
Now, we may have a suspect. Is that what led to her death?
But then, detectives get a promising break in the case.
Come here. Detective Jones, Yonkers PD.
Yonkers is a suburb of North Manhattan, about 40 minutes southeast of Spring Valley.
I heard about the case you were working on, and it sounded extremely familiar.
He said they had someone in their jurisdiction that committed almost the same similar type of sadistic homicide.
Check it out.
The Yonkers detective explains that in August of 1990, a woman named Rosie Vasquez was brutally murdered in their jurisdiction.
Yonkers police said that they had arrested and tried a gentleman named Bradford Wise for mutilating his girlfriend Rosie's body almost in a similar fashion to what happened to Beatrice.
Rosie was a small, petite Hispanic girl who was then post-mortem terribly mutilated. It fit all the same pattern of Beatrice's murder.
However, when it went to trial, the jury found Bradford not guilty. He was acquitted of all charges and walked out a free man.
We were sure it was him based on the circumstantial evidence, but we didn't have enough physical evidence to convince the jury.
After he was acquitted of the crime, he still calls the police and taunts them with details about where they can find different parts of Rosie's body.
It's been absolutely maddening.
The police can't do anything about it because double jeopardy, meaning he can't be rearrested and retried for a crime he was already arrested and tried and acquitted of.
But Yonkers police are convinced if Bradford got away with murder once, he could have tried to do it again.
If it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. So Bradford became the #1 suspect.
It started to really sound like we had a serial killer on the loose.
Detectives in Spring Valley, New York, investigating the brutal murder of 20-year-old Beatrice Alvarez, have just received a visit from Yonkers police.
Yonkers detectives say they handled a case similar a few years earlier, and the alleged killer, Bradford Wise, was never incarcerated for the crime.
It started to really sound like we had a serial killer on the loose.
Thanks for passing this along, Detective.
Absolutely.
Investigators know that if there really is a serial killer at large in their community, they need to act fast.
I've got my guys searching for him as we speak. We'll be in touch.
They start trying to find Bradford to talk to him.
But the next day, their fervor comes to a screeching halt.
Anderson. Oh, hey, Detective Jones. Any sign of Bradford?
Bradford had recently been arrested on arson charges in a neighboring community. He'd been in jail at Westchester County, awaiting trial since late May.
Since police believe Beatrice was killed in early June, it would have been impossible for Bradford to commit the crime.
I'm so sorry to get your hopes up.
It's okay. We appreciate your help.
Just let me know if there's anything else that I can do.
Thanks, Jones.
That deconstructed the whole idea that they had their guy.
It wasn't Bradford.
Damn.
With their strongest lead now a dead end, detectives shift their focus to their victim's most recent ex-boyfriend, Vinicio Valverde.
Hi, are you Mr. Valverde?
Yes.
So the detectives asked Mr. Valverde if they could speak with him about Beatrice Alvarez.
At the mention of Beatrice's name, Vinicio immediately got emotional.
Yes, come in. I still can't believe she's gone.
Vinicio invites the police into his apartment.
And something inside immediately catches the attention of detectives.
What caught my eye right away was this makeshift shrine, or whatever we want to call it.
It had upside down prayer cards. It had pictures of women, some with pins in them. And it also had what appeared to be a pentagram on the bottom.
And in that shrine was a photo of Beatrice Alvarez.
It really caught my eye, but Mr. Valverde, he didn't seem too nervous about it.
What's that?
Oh, it's supposed to give you good luck.
He said it was some spiritualism that he hoped would bring her back to him since she had left, and that the shrine was devoted to Beatrice's return.
Even though she was deceased, he was hoping she would return to him in spirit.
It's our understanding that Beatrice left you for a musician shortly before she was murdered. Is that correct?
Yes. It broke my heart.
He's not able to provide any other defining characteristics about the musician or where they may have gone.
I asked him, how did he meet Beatrice? And it was through a friend that he knew by the name of Felipe, who worked in the city.
Beatrice had been dating Felipe. They were living together.
When Beatrice and I met, it was like boom, fireworks.
He said he never intended to steal his friend's girl, but they had a connection and neither one of them could resist.
But apparently he treated her bad.
Vinicio says Beatrice opened up to him about her relationship with Felipe, and it raised cause for alarm.
He said Felipe was abusing Beatrice and kept her locked up in a room.
He was keeping her like a prisoner.
Spring Valley detectives are speaking with Vinicio Valverde about the murder of his ex-girlfriend, 20-year-old aspiring artist, Beatrice Alvarez. According to Vinicio, Beatrice had a tumultuous relationship with her other ex, Felipe Rivera.
He would hit her. He would lock her up.
How do you know this?
She told me.
Beatrice had told him that he was keeping her like a prisoner. He was trying to poison her. He was abusive, and she couldn't get away fast enough.
Vinicio says he knew he needed to step in to save Beatrice.
He was able to convince her that if she left Felipe and left with him, that he can give her a better life. She was so excited to start this new life that she actually goes back to the shop, breaks up with her boyfriend, and literally packs up what she has, all her life savings and stuff, and goes with Vinicio and ends up moving in with him in Spring Valley.
But apparently I couldn't make her happy.
Beatrice told him she was going to leave him and left with a musician who lived in Manhattan.
Just like that, Beatrice was gone. Vinicio said he hadn't seen her since.
But despite Beatrice leaving with the mysterious musician, Vinicio believes someone else is responsible for what happened to her.
You know, I think Felipe did this.
Vinicio started crying, very, very tearful, and had immediately pinned her murder on her former lover, Felipe.
Felipe Rivera did this.
He's heartbroken. He's upset. He was assuming that she went back to Felipe and he started his abuse again and possibly took it too far.
There's no telling what he's capable of.
Detectives fear Vinicio might be right.
Police now have to interview Felipe. If even half of what Vinicio was saying is true, maybe he is the real suspect.
We locate him in the city, and we have a conversation with him and ask him if he would come back with us to Spring Valley. And he was more than willing to.
I just can't believe that she's gone. Even though things did not work out between us, I'll always have love for that girl.
Basically, he tells us he was in love with Beatrice, that was the love of his life, and that his friend, who was supposed to just go out on a lunch date with her, Mr. Valverde, ends up taking his girlfriend.
Is it true that you were controlling of Beatrice when you were together? Abusive?
What? Never.
When they tell Felipe all the horrible things his friend Vinicio has said about him, he kind of loses it a little.
I mean, if anything, Vinicio was the abusive one. She told me so.
Felipe's like, wait a minute. She told me that Vinicio was the one who is the abusive one. And so now you got, he said.
She could not stand him. I mean, he was crazy. She wanted my help to get her out.
Basically, she's now asking Felipe for money and stuff, and she wants to go back.
I feel guilty for even introducing her to him in the first place. I mean, he's shown me his true colors before.
This is where it takes a really bizarre turn.
Felipe told us that he knew for a fact that Valverde practiced some kind of black magic and that he believes that he can read minds and that he can control people.
It's a stunning claim, but is his story true?
As Felipe is telling us about this black magic, I'm really still not sold on it. And then Felipe is telling me how he was trying to give Vinicio a job in his shop.
This was a few months before Vinicio and Beatrice met.
Vinicio Valverde was trying to offer his services of being what you would, I guess, call a mind reader, a psychic, someone that can heal people.
Felipe thought Vinicio's services would be a great addition to his shop, but shortly after being hired, the situation took a chilling turn.
This looks good.
Something's not right.
What do you mean?
I guess he felt that the energy in the store needed to be shifted.
A sacrifice must be made.
And so he had a dove with him, and he wanted to sacrifice the dove in the store to purify it.
Wait, Vinicio, this is too much.
Fine. You just don't understand.
Mr. Valverde instead took out a syringe and put it into the dove, drew out some blood, and then put a drop of the blood from the dove in each of his eyes.
Vinicio thought he had power through black magic, power over women, power to control situations. And this is how he used these sacrificing techniques and other rituals.
Was Beatrice Alvarez just another one of Vinicio's sacrificial lambs?
It's beyond sociopathy. It's beyond psychopathology.
Homicide detectives in Spring Valley, New York, have just learned that Vinicio Valverde was exhibiting some chilling behavior before his ex-girlfriend, 20-year-old Beatrice Alvarez, was killed and dismembered.
Vinicio was known to practice black magic and did show some violent tendencies.
Beatrice's other ex, Felipe Rivera, says he witnessed it firsthand after hiring Vinicio to work in his shop.
I'm open to many different spiritual practices. But that was too much, even for me.
Felipe was like, I can't be having this in my shop.
The tapes of service Vinicio was providing were just way too extreme, so Felipe stopped having him work there.
I mean, we remained friends afterwards. I just thought he was a good guy at heart who had gotten too deep into black magic. But now I believe I was wrong.
And when detectives dig deeper into Vinicio Valverde's background, they discover even more disconcerting information.
Vinicio stole a book on demonology from the New York Library. He was trying to do these evil spells on his ex-wife.
Right there, that threw up a flag right away because now that took my mind back to this memorial that's in Mr. Valverde's apartment.
In that shrine back in his apartment, there was a picture of a woman with pins stuck in it, and that was his ex-wife.
They really started looking into this stuff, realizing that, wait a minute, this is not a call to action for a loved one to come home. This shrine was to take control of someone's spirit.
But are Vinicio's spiritual practices really the signs of a deranged killer?
The detectives did their research and learned that whenever someone who practices black magic kills somebody, they keep a trophy of the person to keep their spirit under control in the afterlife.
They must take a body part and keep it close to them. And as long as they have that body part, the soul cannot come back to haunt them or hurt them.
So they felt like if Vinicio really did this, he may have some parts of Beatrice in his home, most likely her hands, since they know that they were missing from her body.
On July 14th, Spring Valley police execute a search warrant at Vinicio's apartment, and inside the bedroom, they make an alarming discovery.
To my shock, there was blood everywhere.
There was blood splatter all over the walls. There was blood on the floor.
As soon as I flipped the mattress over at the head part, you could see a big red stain that appeared to be blood.
Obviously, things are taking a different turn now after the find of this blood.
But that's not all they find.
I recall going into one of the dresser drawers, and I found female fingernails and human teeth.
And they find a hammer, and what they remember from the ME's report was that Beatrice's body was hit, blunt force trauma to the head.
There was a saw and a large knife, so you could see that these were probably the murder weapons.
Investigators also locate something near and dear to Beatrice, her sketchbook.
So I had already learned that Beatrice did not go anywhere without her sketchbook. That was her world.
She absolutely would not have left it behind. So why was it there?
But one crucial piece of evidence is still missing: Beatrice's severed hands.
I'm now convinced that the hands are somewhere in there. But it's a small room, and I turned that room upside down. I couldn't find it. So my next thing was I reached out to an agency that had cadaver dogs. The dog kept hitting on the small closet, and I went in the closet. I took all the clothes out of the closet, emptied the closet out.
And they're looking and they're looking. Dogs know, and the handler knows this dog is sensing something, but they just don't see anything.
But then the dog starts to get on his hind leg and starts pointing up. And so the police are looking up.
The handler looked up inside the closet, and he saw what appeared to be a false ceiling.
I see the handler reach up, and he pulls down this fake and...
Down dropped a hand, a mummified hand.
Spring Valley investigators have just made a series of gruesome discoveries inside the bedroom of 32-year-old Vinicio Valverde.
Police believe that Vinicio killed his ex-girlfriend, Beatrice Alvarez. They found blood spatter and other human remains inside of his apartment.
But the most shocking evidence of all is located in the bedroom closet.
I see the handler reach up, and he pulls down this fake and...
Down dropped a hand, a mummified hand.
I hear him yelling. He goes, "I found what you're looking for." The only problem was it was mummified.
Since the hand is mummified, obtaining the forensic evidence to officially link it to Beatrice Alvarez will be especially challenging.
They needed to rush it to the medical examiner and see what he could do.
No matter how hard or where I checked, I could not find the other hand.
Fortunately, the medical examiner has a plan to rejuvenate the fingerprints from the hand found in Vinicio's closet.
He had perfected a method to rehydrate mummified hands. And so, given his technique that he had developed, we were able to rehydrate the hand.
They get a fingerprint impression and they send off the prints for testing.
And finally, we got that break where it came back that that hand did belong to Beatrice Alvarez.
For investigators, this proves without a doubt Vinicio is their man. Now all they need is a confession.
They take him into custody and bring him to the police headquarters.
We found some very interesting things at your place, Vinicio.
Once they tell him the hand was in your apartment, it matches Beatrice. Does he break down at this point? Absolutely not. He is not admitting to anything.
Well, I didn't kill her.
He was calm, he was cool, he was collected, he was a killer.
You guys must have planted it.
So as a last-ditch effort, He now tries to blame the police for planting the hand in his closet, which is absurd.
Someone is framing me. I swear.
At this point, detectives are done listening to Vinicio's excuses.
He never really owned up to it, but based on the overwhelming evidence, we were convinced already that we had enough.
Benicio Valverde is charged with second-degree murder for the killing of Beatrice Alvarez.
He was not charged with murder in the first degree because you need more mitigating factors.
First-degree murder is very difficult to prove because you have to have the perfect set of circumstances to prove first-degree murder. In this instance, the cops did not have witnesses. The body wasn't found until way after the fact.
And Vinicio definitely isn't going down easy.
While he was pending trial, there was a moment where he tried to kill himself with a bedsheet.
He tries to end his life so he doesn't have to face his punishment.
Thank God the corrections officers were on duty and they caught it right away and they prevented him from taking his own life.
After his failed suicide attempt, Vinicio is strictly monitored until his trial begins in July 1999.
This is a person who was aloof, who really didn't have too many social connections, but heavily relied on connecting with the spiritual world.
And as the prosecution presents their case, they explain how Vinicio's connection to the spiritual world intersected with a dangerous obsession that led to murder.
It was my view of the evidence that we had that this was what you would kind of call a crime of passion.
The theory of this is that Mr. Valverde met this gorgeous young lady, instantly fell in love with her. He was very jealous of her, very controlling of her.
And his involvement with black magic was starting to make her feel really uncomfortable.
Prosecutors say that eventually, Beatrice had enough.
Where do you think you're going?
I can't stay here anymore, Vinicio.
You lost your mind?
I'm going. You're not who I thought you were.
Beatrice was planning to exit the relationship.
And that was the ultimate slap in the face for a person like this. It was an insult to his masculinity, to his alleged powers of black magic, and he couldn't let that go.
It was my argument to the jury that if he couldn't have her, then nobody would.
So he carried out his most sadistic ritual yet.
First, her skull was bashed.
Show you who I really am.
And then, after she was killed, he proceeded to humiliate and dismember the corpse.
He found a way to remove her from this physical world in efforts to connect with her in the spiritual world so that she would never leave him.
After that, Vinicio put her body in plastic bags and took it to a secluded area to burn.
But when the body didn't burn completely like he had hoped, he decided to take what was left and throw it in a local creek.
For a while, Vinicio thought he got away with murder, but then the storm hit.
He didn't expect that weeks later it would flood so bad to push her body downstream, where she was eventually discovered.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
After a week-long trial, it takes jurors only 5 hours to return with a verdict.
It didn't take long for the jury to come back with a verdict of guilty. And Vinicio was convicted of second-degree homicide.
Mr. Valverde was sentenced to the maximum under the law of 25 years to life. He is currently serving that sentence. At the trial, there were some family members that did attend on behalf of Beatrice, so it was really satisfying that we were able to bring the family members of Beatrice Alvarez some sense of justice, given the viciousness of this crime.
He was denied parole in May of 2023.
With her killer now behind bars, Beatrice's memory lives on in those who knew and loved her.
We lost a major, I want to say an angel. a true American dream. You're talking about somebody that came from Cuba, came here with nothing but a dream. Just imagine what this young lady could have been today.
She had the world, she had time, she had everything ahead of her, and it was cut short because of the selfishness of one person.
There is truly no happy ending to this because a life was lost, but it does give you a little good feeling knowing that we were able to bring a closure to the family. You'll never forget, you'll never forgive, but you can start to heal.
She didn't realize that this wasn't a man that she was dealing with. This was a devil she was dealing with.
There are mornings that disappear into history without anyone noticing. Then there are mornings that divide time itself into two separate worlds before and after. On the morning of May 25th, still 1979, the streets of Lower Manhattan looked ordinary. Delivery trucks rumbled through narrow blocks. Shopkeepers unlocked storefronts. Office workers hurried towards subway entrances. Children prepared for another school day. Nothing about the sunrise suggested that by lunchtime, one 6-year-old boy would vanish without a trace, leaving behind one of the most influential missing child investigations in American history. His name was Eaton Patz, and for millions of parents, that ordinary Friday morning would forever change the meaning of letting a child walk to school alone. New York City in 1979 was a city of contradictions. It was energetic, creative, crowded, and resilient, but it was also grappling with high crime rates and public concerns about safety. The Soho neighborhood, where the Patz family lived, was undergoing transformation. Former industrial buildings were becoming artists' lofts. Galleries were opening. Families had begun moving into spaces that only years earlier had been occupied by warehouses and factories. The neighborhood carried an atmosphere unlike any other in Manhattan, a blend of creativity, construction, and constant change. For Stanley and Julie Patz, Soho was home. They were raising their family in an environment that felt familiar and increasingly connected. Neighbors recognized one another. Children played nearby. Daily routines developed naturally. Like countless parents, they balanced caution with the growing independence every child eventually seeks. Eaton was the youngest of their children. He had bright eyes, an unmistakable smile, and a personality that family members later described as curious, energetic, and observant. Photographs from the period show a cheerful little boy whose face would soon become recognized across the United States. At 6 years old, he was beginning to experience the small freedoms that mark childhood, walking short distances, learning responsibility, discovering confidence. And one of those milestones arrived on Friday, May 25th. But for the first time, Eaton would walk to his school bus stop alone. The distance was short, only about 2 blocks. His parents had discussed it carefully. They believed he was ready. Children throughout the city routinely made similar walks. Nothing about the decision appeared unusual. Before leaving, Eaton asked if he could carry $1 to buy a soda on the way home from school. His mother agreed. She packed his lunch. He put on his distinctive blue cap. He wore blue pants and sneakers. Everything about the morning reflected normal family life. There was no argument, no sign of fear, no indication that this routine school day would become anything other than another page in an ordinary childhood. Shortly after 8 a.m., Eaton left the apartment. His destination was the school bus stop. He never arrived. At first, nothing seemed alarming. Children occasionally missed buses. Schedules changed. Perhaps he had become distracted. Perhaps he had gone to a friend's apartment. And perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Ordinary explanations always arrive before extraordinary ones. When the school bus reached its destination without Eaton, concern began quietly replacing assumption. His teacher recognized that he was absent. His parents expected him to return home that afternoon. As the hours passed, uncertainty became fear. When Eaton failed to come home after school, Stanley and Julie immediately realized something was terribly wrong. They began searching themselves. Neighbors joined. Friends spread through nearby streets. His name echoed between brick buildings. People checked hallways, courtyards, construction sites, and familiar neighborhood locations. No one could find him. Its search expanded rapidly. Calls were placed to the New York City Police Department. Officers responded quickly. Missing child cases already demanded urgent attention, but investigators initially faced the difficult challenge common to such reports. Children sometimes wandered away. Some returned within hours. Others were located with relatives or neighbors. Detectives had to determine whether this disappearance reflected a misunderstanding or something far more serious. Time passed. No sign of Eaton emerged. The investigation escalated. Police officers began canvassing the neighborhood. Businesses were visited. Residents were interviewed. Workers who had been present that morning were asked what they had seen. Detectives attempted to reconstruct every minute between Eaton leaving home and the moment it became clear he had vanished. The timeline remained painfully short. He left his apartment. He should have walked 2 blocks. Somewhere within that brief journey, something happened. Investigators immediately recognized the difficulty posed by the environment. Lower Manhattan was busy even in the morning. Pedestrians moved constantly. Vehicles passed through intersections. Construction projects generated noise and activity. Delivery trucks arrived throughout the neighborhood. Hundreds of people could have crossed Eaton's path within only a few minutes. Most would never realize they had shared the same sidewalk as a child who would soon become the center of a nationwide search. Witnesses came forward with various observations. Detectives documented every account carefully. Some remembered seeing a young boy matching Eaton's description. Others recalled unfamiliar individuals in the neighborhood. Every statement required verification. Every possibility demanded investigation. Yet no single witness could explain where the 6-year-old had gone. The absence of certainty became the investigation's first great obstacle. As daylight faded, the search intensified. Police officers expanded the area. Canine units participated. Volunteers organized systematic searches of surrounding streets. Nearby buildings were examined. Rooftops, basements, alleyways, and vacant spaces received attention. Investigators understood a harsh reality familiar to every missing child investigation. The first hours matter. Every passing minute reduces opportunities to recover fresh evidence and identify reliable witnesses. Media attention began almost immediately. Local newspapers reported the disappearance. Television stations interrupted regular programming with updates. Photographs of Eaton appeared across New York City. Parents watched evening broadcasts with growing anxiety. Many imagined their own children making similar walks to school. The case struck a deeply personal nerve. This was not a teenager who had run away, not an adult whose whereabouts were uncertain. This was a first-grade child who had disappeared while performing one of the simplest routines imaginable. The question spread quickly across the city. How could a 6-year-old vanish on a walk lasting only a few minutes? Investigators continued examining every available lead. They interviewed bus drivers, delivery workers, construction employees, store owners, residents, anyone who might have seen something unusual that Friday morning. Every interview became another piece of an incomplete puzzle. Yet no matter how many conversations detectives conducted, the central mystery remained. Where was Eaton Patz? Inside the Patz home, hope and fear collided with every passing hour. The telephone became the center of attention. Every ring suggested possibility. Perhaps someone had found him. Perhaps he was safe. Perhaps the nightmare would end before another sunrise. Those calls never brought the answer everyone wanted, and friends gathered to support the family. Neighbors continued searching. Volunteers distributed information throughout Manhattan. A growing sense of urgency settled across the community. This no longer appeared to be the temporary disappearance of a child who had lost his way. It increasingly resembled something far darker. The investigation expanded beyond neighborhood streets. Police issued alerts throughout the city. Transportation centers received information. Officers across New York were notified. Every reported sighting required immediate evaluation. Most proved unrelated. Some involved children who merely resembled Eaton. Others originated from understandable misunderstandings created by widespread publicity. Detectives pursued each lead regardless. A missing 6-year-old deserved nothing less. Behind every investigative decision stood one objective: find the child alive. As the first day drew to a close, exhaustion spread through everyone involved. Search teams had covered extensive areas. Detectives had conducted countless interviews. Family members had endured hours of uncertainty unlike anything they had ever imagined. Yet despite the extraordinary effort, investigators possessed remarkably little evidence explaining what had occurred. No confirmed destination beyond the bus stop. No reliable account of his disappearance. No definitive witness describing an abduction. Only absence. Only unanswered questions. Only a route measuring to city blocks that somehow concealed one of the greatest mysteries in modern American criminal history. By the end of May 25th, still 1979, New York City understood that a child had disappeared. No one yet realized that Eaton Patz would never be found, that his case would transform the way America responded to missing children, inspire nationwide changes in law enforcement and public awareness, and remain one of the most haunting criminal investigations in the nation's history. For the Patz family, however, none of that future mattered as darkness settled over Manhattan. There was only one unbearable truth. That morning, a little boy had walked out the front door carrying his lunch and a single dollar, expecting to return home before dinner. As night fell, his family waited for footsteps that would never come. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan on May 26th, still 1979, the disappearance of 6-year-old Eaton Patz was no longer a family's private nightmare. It had become a citywide emergency. Somewhere inside one of the busiest urban landscapes in America, a little boy had vanished while walking only 2 blocks to his school bus stop. There was no ransom demand, no confirmed eyewitness who could explain exactly what had happened. No clear direction for investigators to follow. The most frightening possibility was beginning to take hold inside police headquarters and across lower Manhattan. If Eaton had been abducted, every passing hour dramatically reduced the chances of finding him alive. The New York City Police Department expanded the investigation with urgency. Detectives assigned to missing person cases were joined by additional investigators, uniformed officers, and specialized search teams. The first objective remained simple in theory, but overwhelming in practice: reconstruct every minute of Eaton's brief walk from his family's apartment toward the bus stop. Officers returned to the route repeatedly, measuring distances, documenting intersections, and identifying every doorway, business, alley, and construction site that could have been relevant. Although the journey should have taken only a few minutes, the number of people moving through the neighborhood during the morning rush created an enormous investigative challenge. Hundreds of pedestrians had crossed those sidewalks. Delivery trucks had come and gone. Construction workers had started their shifts. Office employees hurried toward work. Any one of them might have seen something important without realizing its significance. Detectives interviewed everyone they could locate. Shop owners described the ordinary rhythm of the morning. Delivery drivers recalled stopping along nearby streets. Construction workers explained where they had been positioned. Residents leaned from apartment windows, trying to remember whether anything unusual had caught their attention. Every interview was carefully documented. Every observation, no matter how minor, was evaluated. Investigators understood that seemingly insignificant details often become critical in missing child investigations. A vehicle parked where it did not belong, a stranger standing on a corner, a child speaking with an unfamiliar adult. Tiny fragments sometimes become the first threads leading toward the truth. Volunteers flooded Soho almost immediately. Neighbors who had known the Patz family for years searched building by building. Artists left their studios to help. Parents walked block after block carrying photographs of Eaton. Community members organized search parties that stretched far beyond the immediate neighborhood. Vacant buildings were inspected. Rooftops were searched. Basements, stairwells, loading docks, abandoned industrial spaces, and fenced lots were examined repeatedly. Every location that might conceal a frightened child received attention. Search dogs joined the operation, attempting to follow Eaton's scent. Investigators hoped they might identify the direction he had traveled after leaving home. Yet the dense urban environment complicated every effort. Countless people, vehicles, and overlapping scents made reliable tracking extraordinarily difficult. Manhattan presented challenges very different from those encountered in rural searches. Streets were constantly active. Sidewalks never remained empty. Potential evidence could disappear within minutes beneath the movement of an entire city. As the search continued, the media dramatically increased its coverage. Local television stations interrupted programming with updates. Newspapers devoted front-page space to the disappearance. Radio broadcasts urged listeners to report any possible sighting. Eaton's photograph began appearing throughout New York. Parents studying those images recognized something deeply unsettling. The smiling 6-year-old could have been any child in America. His disappearance shattered the comforting belief that children were safest performing ordinary daily routines close to home. The Patz family became the emotional center of the investigation. Stanley and Julie Patz spoke with investigators repeatedly, answering every question that might help establish Eaton's routine, personality, friendships, and habits. Detectives asked difficult but necessary questions. Had anyone recently shown unusual interest in the family? Had Eaton mentioned strangers? Were there custody disputes, family conflicts, or individuals who might wish to harm the child? Investigators pursued every possibility because the earliest stage of any missing child investigation requires considering every reasonable explanation before narrowing the focus. Nothing immediately suggested that Eaton had disappeared voluntarily. He was 6 years old. He had packed his lunch. He expected to attend school. He had asked for $1 to buy a soda after classes. Everything about the morning reflected normal childhood expectations. The possibility that he had intentionally left his routine simply did not fit the known facts. This realization intensified investigators' concern. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, they confirmed that Eaton never boarded his school bus. The driver had not seen him. Classmates had not seen him. Teachers expected him to arrive but quickly realized he was absent. This narrowed the critical window even further. Whatever had happened almost certainly occurred between the moment he left his apartment building and the time the bus departed only minutes later. That tiny window became one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. Witness reports slowly began reaching investigators. Some individuals believed they had seen a young boy matching Eaton's description. Others described unfamiliar men or unusual vehicles in the neighborhood. Detectives investigated each report with equal seriousness. Most ultimately proved unrelated. Human memory is imperfect, especially after unexpected events receive widespread publicity. Investigators understood that sincere witnesses can unintentionally confuse dates, times, or appearances. Every lead required careful verification before becoming part of the investigation. Among the many reports received, several involved sightings that could never be fully confirmed or completely dismissed. This uncertainty would haunt the investigation for decades. Every unverified observation raised difficult questions. Had someone briefly seen Eaton after he left home? Had another witness unknowingly observed the offender? Or were these simply ordinary encounters later connected to the case because of overwhelming public attention? Detectives documented everything, recognizing that information dismissed today might become meaningful years later. As the second day passed without success, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the investigation changed dramatically. Hope remained, but urgency became unmistakable. Search operations expanded beyond Manhattan. Information was shared with surrounding jurisdictions. Transportation hubs received notices describing Eaton. Airports, bus terminals, and rail stations became part of the growing effort. Law enforcement agencies recognized that if an abduction had occurred, the child could potentially be moved far beyond New York City within hours. Meanwhile, volunteers continued distributing thousands of flyers. Long before the internet or social media, physical photographs became one of the most powerful investigative tools available. Posters appeared in storefront windows, community centers, schools, telephone poles, and subway stations. Every image carried the same hope that someone, somewhere, had seen the missing child and simply had not yet realized it. The disappearance also exposed significant limitations within the missing child response systems of the late 1970s. There was no nationwide digital database connecting police departments. Information traveled through telephone calls, printed bulletins, and television broadcasts. Coordination required enormous manual effort. Detectives often depended upon local cooperation rather than integrated national networks. The Patz investigation would eventually become one of the cases that inspired major reforms in how missing child information is shared across the United States. Inside police headquarters, investigators organized mountains of incoming information. Every telephone call generated another report. Every reported sighting required documentation. Every possible witness had to be interviewed. The volume became overwhelming, yet detectives understood that among hundreds of inaccurate tips might be one critical fact capable of solving the entire case. The challenge was separating valuable information from understandable public speculation. Days turned into weeks. The search never truly stopped, but the character of the investigation gradually evolved. The hope of locating a lost child increasingly gave way to the difficult task of determining exactly what crime had occurred. Without a body, without a confirmed crime scene, without a clear suspect, investigators faced one of the most difficult scenarios in criminal investigation: a disappearance surrounded by almost complete uncertainty. For Stanley and Julie Patz, every morning brought another painful routine. They waited beside the telephone. They met with detectives. They answered reporters' questions. They reviewed possible sightings. They tried to remain hopeful despite the absence of evidence. Like many families of missing children, they found themselves living in an impossible space between hope and fear. Without answers, neither emotion could fully replace the other. Across New York City, parents responded in ways that would permanently reshape everyday life. Many stopped allowing young children to walk alone. School routines changed. Conversations about child safety became common in homes that had never previously imagined such dangers. A single disappearance had altered the behavior of an entire city. Yet despite the massive search, the countless interviews, the relentless media coverage, and the extraordinary efforts of investigators and volunteers, one devastating reality remained unchanged. 6-year-old Ethan Patz had vanished in the middle of one of the busiest cities in the world, without leaving behind a single clear explanation. Somewhere inside the thousands of interviews, the scattered witness statements, and the unanswered questions lay the truth. But in the spring of 1979, that truth remained hidden, and the investigation was about to enter a phase defined not by certainty, but by years of frustrating dead ends, elusive suspects, and a mystery that refused to let go of New York City. The first weeks after Ethan Patz disappeared were filled with a kind of urgency that only a missing child case can create. Every hour carried the possibility of discovery. Every telephone call could bring the news that investigators and family members desperately wanted to hear. But as the days passed, the investigation entered a more difficult and uncertain stage. The massive searches continued, yet the simple question that had haunted New York City since May 25th, still 1979, remained unanswered. Where was Ethan Patz? For detectives, the case presented an almost impossible challenge. There was a missing child, but no confirmed crime scene. There was a disappearance, but no clear timeline beyond a few critical minutes. There were possible witnesses, but no account that explained exactly what had happened. Investigators were trying to solve a crime without knowing precisely what crime had occurred. At the beginning, every possibility had to be considered. A child could become lost. A child could wander into danger. A child could be taken by someone known to the family. A child could be abducted by a stranger. Detectives could not afford to ignore any theory. The investigation expanded in every direction. Police examined Ethan's family background, his daily routine, his neighborhood, and the people who regularly moved through the area. Detectives spoke with neighbors and searched for anyone who might have had contact with him. They reviewed the locations surrounding his route to the bus stop, attempting to identify places where an offender might have approached him or where evidence might have been left behind. The absence of physical evidence became one of the greatest obstacles. In many criminal investigations, evidence creates a path, a fingerprint, a weapon, a vehicle description, a witness who sees the entire event. In Ethan's case, investigators had almost none of those things. The city itself seemed to have swallowed the clues. Lower Manhattan was constantly changing. The streets were crowded. Buildings were filled with residents, workers, and visitors. Construction activity created noise and movement. The same environment that made Soho vibrant also made it extremely difficult to determine what had happened during those few crucial minutes. Every possible lead had to be tested. Some witnesses reported seeing a child resembling Ethan. Others remembered unusual people in the area. Some described suspicious vehicles. Each statement was investigated. Many turned out to be misunderstandings. Some could not be confirmed. A few remained part of the larger mystery because investigators could never completely determine whether they were connected. This uncertainty became one of the defining features of the case. The investigation also faced another major challenge common to missing child cases. The passage of time. The longer a child remained missing, the more difficult it became to preserve the possibility of a quick recovery. Fresh evidence disappeared. Memories became less reliable. Witnesses struggled to remember exact details. Investigators knew that the earliest days were critical, but they also understood they needed patience and precision. The New York Police Department continued receiving tips from the public. The number became enormous. Thousands of people contacted authorities with possible information. Some callers genuinely believed they had seen Eaton. Others were responding to fear and uncertainty created by the intense media coverage. Detectives followed every serious lead, but the sheer volume of information created another challenge: finding the one piece that could break the case open. The investigation soon attracted national attention. Eaton's face appeared on television screens and newspapers throughout the United States. His disappearance became a symbol of the fears many parents had but rarely discussed. Before his case, many Americans had never seen a missing child's photograph displayed so prominently. The image of a young boy with a bright smile became impossible to forget. But behind the public attention was a painful reality. A family was waiting for answers. Every headline represented a tragedy that had not been resolved. Every broadcast reminded Stanley and Julie Patz that their son was still missing. The media attention brought awareness, but it also created pressure. Investigators faced expectations to solve the case quickly despite the absence of evidence. Public interest demanded progress. Detectives knew that solving a case required more than public concern. It required facts. As months passed, investigators began examining potential suspects. In a case involving a missing child, detectives must consider everyone who could have had access to the victim. Friends, acquaintances, neighbors, strangers. All possibilities must be evaluated. The process is difficult because suspicion alone cannot prove involvement. Investigators must separate genuine leads from speculation. Several individuals would eventually become associated with the Eaton Patz investigation over the decades. Some attracted attention because of their behavior. Others became suspects because of new information that emerged years later. But in the early stages of the investigation, no suspect could be definitively linked to Eaton's disappearance. The case remained open. The file continued growing, but answers remained out of reach. By the early 1980s, the disappearance had become one of America's most recognized missing child cases. Eaton's image continued appearing in public awareness campaigns. His case helped bring national attention to the problem of child abductions and the need for improved systems to respond to missing children. One of the most lasting impacts of the case was the way it changed public awareness. Before Eaton disappeared, many families believed missing child cases were rare events that happened somewhere else to someone else. The Patz investigation destroyed that sense of distance. Parents across America began having new conversations with their children. Where can you go? Who can you trust? What should you do if someone approaches you? Schools and communities began placing greater emphasis on child safety. The tragedy of one child became a catalyst for national awareness. Yet for the Patz family, public recognition could never replace the one thing they wanted most: their son. Years passed. The investigation continued, but the case grew colder. Cold cases are not defined only by the passage of time. They are defined by the absence of new information. And for the investigators working on Eaton's disappearance, the hardest reality was that the central mystery remained unchanged. A little boy left home. He never reached the bus stop. No one could explain where he went. No one could say with certainty who was responsible. The case became a haunting example of how a person can disappear even in a crowded city surrounded by thousands of potential witnesses. As the years moved forward, detectives changed. Technology changed. Investigative methods changed. But the question remained the same. What happened to Eaton Patz? The answer would not come quickly. It would not come in months. It would not come in years. For decades, the investigation would exist between hope and uncertainty. Every new piece of information carried the possibility of finally solving the mystery. Every dead end brought another wave of disappointment. The Patz family continued living with an absence that never became easier. Birthdays passed. Anniversaries passed. Years accumulated. But the search for answers never completely disappeared. The disappearance of Eaton Patz became more than a single criminal investigation. It became a symbol of every missing child whose family waits for a phone call that may never come. It represented the uncertainty that defines unresolved cases, the endless questions, the unanswered possibilities, the search for truth that continues even when the world moves forward. And while New York City slowly returned to normal after the initial shock, one investigation remained frozen in time. The morning of May 25th, SIL 1979. A 6-year-old boy walking toward a school bus. A short journey that should have ended with a normal day at school. A routine moment that became one of the most unforgettable mysteries in American history. For years, investigators would chase leads, examine suspects, and search for evidence hidden beneath decades of silence. But the most important clue had not yet appeared. And the case of Eaton Patz was only beginning its long journey through one of the most complex and emotionally powerful investigations the United States had ever seen. For years after Eaton Patz disappeared, his photograph remained one of the most recognizable images in America. A smiling 6-year-old boy wearing a blue cap became a symbol of a question that refused to disappear. Where was Eaton? What happened during those few minutes between his apartment and the school bus stop? And why, despite one of the largest searches in New York City history, had investigators found no clear answer? The disappearance had begun as a local tragedy in Soho, but it soon became something much larger. It transformed into a national conversation about missing children, child safety, and the terrifying possibility that a child could vanish in an ordinary moment. Before Eaton's case, many Americans did not fully understand the scale or complexity of missing child investigations. There was no nationwide alert system connecting police departments instantly. There was no widespread digital database allowing investigators across states to compare information. Families of missing children often struggled to get national attention. Cases could remain isolated within local jurisdictions, even when the search required a much broader response. Eaton Patz's disappearance exposed those limitations. The image of his face changed everything. His parents, Stanley and Julie Patz, understood that keeping Eaton's story visible was essential. They continued seeking information, speaking publicly, and making sure that people did not forget the little boy who had vanished from their neighborhood. Their efforts became part of a larger movement demanding greater awareness and stronger systems for protecting children. The idea was simple but powerful. A missing child should not disappear twice. First from their family, then from public attention. The Patz family fought against that second disappearance. Eaton's photograph appeared on posters, newspapers, television broadcasts, and public notices. His face became associated with one of the earliest major missing child awareness campaigns in the United States. Millions of people who had never heard of Soho or New York's Lower Manhattan now knew the name Eaton Patz. For many parents, his story created a new fear. If a child could disappear while walking only a few blocks in a familiar neighborhood, could it happen anywhere? That question changed daily life across America. Parents became more cautious. Children were given stricter instructions. Communities began organizing safety programs. The idea of stranger danger became deeply embedded in American culture. The tragedy of one family reshaped the childhood experiences of millions of others. But behind the national conversation was still an unresolved criminal investigation. Detectives continued working. The case file continued growing. Tips continued arriving. Yet the fundamental mystery remained. There was no body. There was no confirmed crime scene. There was no identified offender. Without those elements, investigators faced a difficult task. They were trying to solve a disappearance while lacking the evidence that normally drives a homicide investigation. The investigation moved through different phases as years passed. Some theories gained attention and later faded. Some individuals became subjects of interest. Some possibilities were investigated and eliminated. Others remained unresolved. One of the challenges was the nature of missing child cases themselves. Investigators must often work with incomplete information. A child may have encountered someone for only seconds. A witness may have seen something without realizing its importance. A potential suspect may have left the area before investigators understood the significance of their actions. Time can protect the truth. It can also hide it. The Eaton Patz case became a powerful example of that reality. As the 1980s progressed, the country continued to follow developments in the investigation. Eaton's name remained familiar because his case represented more than one disappearance. It represented the fears of an entire generation of parents. The case also became connected to broader changes in how America approached missing children. Public pressure increased for better coordination between law enforcement agencies. Advocates pushed for stronger resources. Families demanded that missing child cases receive greater attention. The disappearance of Eaton Patz became one of the events that helped create momentum for national reforms. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan designated May 25th, the anniversary of Eaton's disappearance, as National Missing Children's Day. The date was chosen to honor missing children across the country and to raise awareness about efforts to locate them and prevent future tragedies. For the Patz family, the recognition carried complicated emotions. On one hand, it ensured that Eaton's name would never be forgotten. On the other hand, it served as an annual reminder that their own search remained unfinished. Every year on May 25th, the country remembered missing children. The Patz family remembered their son. That distinction was deeply personal. Public memory can transform a case into a symbol. Families live with the reality behind that symbol every day. As the years continued, investigators attempted to keep the case alive. New detectives reviewed old reports. Evidence was examined again when new technology became available. The department understood that unsolved cases could change with time. A witness might come forward. A scientific breakthrough might reveal information hidden for years. A new investigative approach might uncover something previously overlooked. Cold cases often survive because someone refuses to accept that the absence of answers is the final answer. The Eaton Patz investigation became exactly that kind of case. A file that remained open. A question that remained unanswered. A family that continued waiting. The passing years brought painful milestones. Eaton grew older only in photographs. His classmates grew up. His neighborhood changed. The city transformed. Buildings were renovated. Businesses closed and reopened. New generations moved into Soho without knowing that one of America's most famous missing child cases began on those same streets. But for investigators and the Patz family, time did not erase the importance of the case. It increased it. Every year without answers added another layer of mystery. Every anniversary renewed public attention. Every new technology created another possibility. The investigation became a bridge between different eras of criminal justice. It began when detectives relied mainly on interviews, physical searches, and traditional investigative methods. It continued through decades of changing forensic science. Eventually, it would become one of the most closely watched cold case investigations in modern American history. But in the years immediately following Eaton's disappearance, there was still no breakthrough, no confession, no definitive suspect, no explanation, only a photograph, a name, a family waiting, and a city that could not forget the little boy who had disappeared from a street that should have been safe. The mystery of Eaton Patz became one of the most haunting questions in New York, a question repeated by detectives, journalists, and parents across the country. How could a 6-year-old child vanish in broad daylight? The answer remained hidden. And as the decades approached, the case entered a long and painful period where hope survived, but certainty remained impossible. The boy whose disappearance changed America had become the face of every unanswered case. But behind the photograph was still a child, a son, a brother, a 6-year-old who left home expecting to return. And for the Patz family, the search was never about a symbol. It was always about finding Eaton. Time is often described as the greatest enemy of a criminal investigation. Memories fade, evidence deteriorates, witnesses move away, communities change. The people who know the answers may no longer be available to provide them. But in some cases, time creates something even more difficult than uncertainty. It creates silence. For the family of Eaton Patz, that silence lasted for decades. The years following Eaton's disappearance became a long journey through unanswered questions. Every anniversary carried the same painful reminder. Another year had passed, and the mystery remained unsolved. The world continued moving forward, but for Stanley and Julie Patz, part of their lives remained permanently connected to the morning of May 25th, SIL 1979. The investigation never officially disappeared. The case file remained. The questions remained. But the public attention that had surrounded the disappearance gradually changed. The television cameras moved away. Newspaper coverage became less frequent. Other tragedies captured national attention. The daily urgency that had surrounded the first days slowly faded into the reality of a cold case. Yet inside the Patz family, there was no such thing as a cold case. There was only a missing child. For law enforcement, the challenge became maintaining focus on a case that had no obvious path forward. Investigators reviewed old information, examined new tips, and followed leads whenever they emerged. But without a confirmed crime scene or physical evidence pointing toward a specific offender, progress was extremely difficult. The case became one of the most frustrating types of investigations in criminal justice. A child was missing. Everyone knew something terrible had likely happened. But proving what happened remained almost impossible. The years also revealed how difficult it was to investigate a disappearance from a previous era. In 1979, forensic technology was far more limited than it would become decades later. DNA profiling, which would eventually transform criminal investigations around the world, was not yet available. Digital databases did not exist. Information sharing between agencies relied on methods that now seem outdated. Investigators had to work with the tools they had: interviews, physical searches, paper records, witness statements, traditional detective methods. Those methods could solve many crimes. But some mysteries required technology that had not yet been invented. The disappearance of Eaton Patz became one of those cases. During the 1980s and 1990s, detectives continued receiving occasional information related to Eaton's disappearance. Some tips came from people who believed they knew something important. Others involved possible sightings or suspicions about individuals. Each report had to be evaluated carefully. Investigators understood that time could create both opportunities and obstacles. A person who had remained silent for years might eventually decide to speak. A witness who had forgotten details might remember something significant. But time could also destroy evidence and weaken memories. The investigation existed in that difficult space between possibility and frustration. One individual who became connected to the case was Jose Antonio Ramos, a convicted child molester who had known Eaton's family through a connection involving a family friend. Ramos became a longtime suspect in the investigation, and authorities pursued information related to him for years. However, despite investigative efforts and public attention surrounding his name, prosecutors were never able to charge him in connection with Eaton's disappearance because there was insufficient evidence directly linking him to the crime. The situation represented one of the most painful realities of criminal investigations. Suspicion is not proof. A person may appear connected to a case. A theory may seem convincing, but the justice system requires evidence. Without evidence, investigators cannot legally establish responsibility. The Eaton Patz case repeatedly confronted that barrier. Potential explanations existed. Potential suspects emerged. But certainty remained out of reach. For the public, the case continued to represent a haunting mystery. For the Patz family, it represented a personal loss that could never be resolved. The years changed the people involved. Children who were young when Eaton disappeared became adults. The neighborhood transformed. New residents arrived who knew nothing about the morning that had changed Soho forever. Technology advanced. Society changed. But one photograph remained instantly recognizable. Eaton's smiling face continued appearing whenever discussions turned to missing children. His image represented both tragedy and hope. Tragedy because a child had vanished. Hope because keeping his story alive meant that someone, somewhere, might still provide the information needed to solve the mystery. The disappearance also influenced the development of missing child awareness in America. The public response to Aiton's case contributed to a growing movement demanding stronger systems for protecting children. Organizations dedicated to missing children gained greater recognition. Law enforcement agencies developed improved methods for responding to reports of missing minors. The country learned painful lessons from cases like Eaton's. Speed matters. Coordination matters. Public awareness matters. The first hours after a child disappears can be critical. Those lessons eventually helped shape a new era of missing child investigations. But for the Patz family, the improvements came too late to answer the question that had haunted them since 1979. Where was their son? As the years passed, investigators occasionally revisited the case using newer approaches. Advances in forensic science created possibilities that had not existed before. Evidence that once seemed limited could potentially be examined in new ways. Cold cases around the country began receiving renewed attention as police departments recognized that old investigations could sometimes be solved through modern techniques. The Eaton Patz case remained one of the most important unsolved mysteries in America. It represented the possibility that an answer might still exist. Somewhere. Hidden. Waiting. The family continued to hope. But hope, after decades, becomes complicated. It is not the same hope felt during the first days of a disappearance. The early hope is immediate and urgent. A phone call, a sighting, a door opening, a child returning home. After decades, hope becomes quieter. It becomes the decision to continue believing that the truth matters. It becomes the refusal to allow a person's disappearance to become forgotten history. The Patz family carried that belief forward. They continued honoring Eaton's memory. They continued supporting efforts related to missing children. They continued seeking answers. Meanwhile, detectives understood that solving the case would require something extraordinary. A new witness. A new piece of evidence. A technological breakthrough. Something capable of breaking through more than 30 years of silence. Then, in the early 2010s, that opportunity finally appeared. A new investigation began. A new location became important. A new name entered the story. After more than 3 decades, detectives returned to Soho with renewed determination. The past was about to collide with the present. And the case that had defined America's missing child crisis was about to enter its most unexpected chapter. For 33 years, the question had remained unanswered. But in 2012, investigators would make a move that shocked the nation. They would reopen the ground beneath an old Manhattan building. They would search a location connected to the original investigation. And they would begin following a lead that would eventually bring the name Pedro Hernandez into one of the most famous cold cases in American history. The silence was beginning to break. But the truth was still buried beneath decades of uncertainty. For more than 3 decades, the disappearance of Eaton Patz remained one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The little boy who walked out of his Soho apartment on May 25th, SIL 1979, had become a symbol of every missing child whose family continued waiting for answers. The years had passed. Investigators had changed. The city had transformed. But the question that began on that morning remained the same. What happened to Eaton Patz? For many cold cases, the passage of time creates the illusion that the investigation has reached its final chapter. Files become inactive. Public attention fades. New generations move forward without knowing the details of what once shocked an entire nation. But some cases never truly disappear. They remain in police archives. They remain in the memories of investigators. They remain in the hearts of families who refuse to accept that unanswered means forgotten. The Eaton Patz investigation was one of those cases. Behind the scenes, detectives continued to monitor developments. Advances in forensic science changed the possibilities of old investigations. DNA technology had transformed criminal justice. Digital records had created new ways of examining historical information. Cold case units across the country began reopening investigations that had once seemed impossible to solve. The disappearance of Eaton Patz remained one of the most significant examples of a case that could benefit from a new era of investigative thinking. Then, in 2012, more than 30 years after Eaton vanished, the case suddenly returned to national attention. The New York Police Department announced that investigators were taking another look at a location connected to the original investigation. The address was in Soho, the same neighborhood where Eaton had disappeared, the same streets where investigators had searched in 1979, the same area that had carried the weight of unanswered questions for decades. The decision to reopen the investigation was based on new information. Detectives returned to examine a building basement at 127 Prince Street, a location that had been considered during the original investigation years earlier. The renewed search attracted immediate media attention. Cameras surrounded the neighborhood. Reporters returned to a case many had thought would never move forward. For residents of Soho, the scene created a powerful sense of history repeating itself. 33 years earlier, the neighborhood had been filled with search teams looking for a missing child. Now investigators had returned, hoping that modern techniques could reveal what earlier searches had missed. The excavation lasted several days. Investigators carefully examined the location. The search did not produce the breakthrough many had hoped for. No remains of Eaton were discovered. No definitive physical evidence emerged that solved the mystery. But the investigation had entered a new phase. The case was active again, and investigators were looking beyond physical searches. They were looking at people. They were reviewing information. They were examining whether someone who had remained silent for decades might finally reveal what happened. Around the same time, detectives received information that would lead them toward a new suspect. That name was Pedro Hernandez. Hernandez was not a stranger to the Soho neighborhood. At the time of Eaton's disappearance, he had worked in the area as a teenager. He had been employed at a nearby business, and investigators learned that he had previously made statements to others suggesting involvement in Eaton's disappearance. For decades, those statements had not resulted in criminal charges. But when detectives examined the information again in 2012, they determined it required further investigation. The case that had been dormant for years suddenly had a new direction. Investigators began examining Hernandez's background and history. They interviewed people connected to him. They explored whether his statements could be verified. They attempted to determine whether the information represented a genuine confession or something else. In cold case investigations, this stage is often one of the most challenging. A statement made years earlier must be carefully evaluated. Was it accurate? Was it misunderstood? Was it influenced by memory, pressure, or other factors? Investigators must separate fact from possibility. The attention surrounding Hernandez grew rapidly. According to authorities, Hernandez eventually made statements to detectives admitting responsibility for Eaton's disappearance and death. The news shocked the public. After 33 years of uncertainty, the case finally appeared to have a possible answer. But the announcement also created immediate questions. Could this confession be trusted? Was there enough evidence to support it? Could prosecutors prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt? The answers would become central issues in the legal battle that followed. Hernandez's confession became one of the most debated elements of the investigation. Prosecutors argued that his statements provided the missing link in a case that had remained unresolved for decades. Defense attorneys later challenged aspects of the confession and questioned its reliability. The investigation moved from the streets of Soho into courtrooms where evidence would be examined under intense scrutiny. But before the legal battle began, the announcement itself had a profound impact. For the Patz family, the news brought emotions that had been impossible to experience for more than 30 years. After decades of uncertainty, there was finally a person accused of being responsible. The mystery had a name attached to it. Yet accusations are not convictions. The criminal justice process requires proof. A confession alone does not automatically answer every question. Investigators still needed to establish what happened, how it happened, and whether the available evidence could withstand courtroom examination. The case had entered a new and uncertain chapter. Across America, people who remembered Eaton's disappearance reacted with shock. Many had grown up knowing his face. They remembered his photograph from missing child campaigns. They remembered the fear his disappearance created among parents. For an entire generation, Eaton represented the child America never stopped searching for. Now, after more than 3 decades, there was finally movement. But movement did not mean resolution. The investigation still carried enormous challenges. There was no recovered body. The physical evidence was limited. The crime had occurred in 1979. Many witnesses had aged. Their memories had changed. The defense would later argue that the case depended heavily on statements made decades after the disappearance. Prosecutors would argue that those statements revealed the truth hidden for years. The debate would become one of the most closely followed criminal proceedings in New York. But before the courtroom battles, there was another important moment. The reopening of the Etan Patz case showed something powerful about modern investigations. No case is truly forgotten as long as evidence, records, and determination remain. The detectives who reopened the investigation were not starting from nothing. They were building upon decades of previous work. The original investigators had documented leads. They had preserved information. They had created a foundation that allowed future detectives to continue searching. The case demonstrated that cold cases are rarely solved by one generation alone. They are often solved through the combined efforts of many. Some investigators search for years without seeing the outcome. Others inherit the case when technology or circumstances finally create new opportunities. Every person involved contributes to the final result. In 2012, the world learned that the disappearance of Etan Patz was no longer only a mystery from the past. It had become an active criminal investigation once again. A suspect had emerged. A confession had been reported. A courtroom battle was approaching. But the central question remained. Would the evidence prove what happened on that morning in 1979? After 33 years of waiting, the search for answers had finally reached its most critical stage. The case that changed America was no longer only about a missing boy. It was now about justice. And the journey toward that justice was about to become one of the most complex and controversial chapters in the history of cold case investigations. For 33 years, the disappearance of Etan Patz existed as one of America's most painful unanswered questions. His photograph had become unforgettable. His name had become part of the national conversation about missing children. Generations of parents had grown up knowing the story of the 6-year-old boy who vanished on his way to a school bus stop in Manhattan. But despite decades of searches, interviews, and investigations, the truth remained hidden. Then, in 2012, everything changed. The case that had gone silent suddenly returned to the center of public attention. A new suspect had emerged. A confession had been reported. And for the first time in more than 3 decades, investigators believed they might finally know what happened to Etan Patz. The name behind this new development was Pedro Hernandez. At the time investigators focused on Hernandez, he was living in New Jersey. He was no longer the teenager who had worked in the Soho neighborhood in 1979. Decades had passed. He had built a life away from the streets where Etan disappeared. But investigators were looking backward. They were examining a moment from the past. A few minutes. A neighborhood. A child. And a person who may have been connected to that morning. According to authorities, information about Hernandez came from statements he had allegedly made years earlier. Those statements became the foundation for renewed police interest. Investigators wanted to determine whether they represented a genuine admission or whether they reflected something else. Cold case investigations often depend on exactly this type of complicated evidence. A statement made years after an event can be extremely important, but it must also be carefully examined. Human memory is complex. People remember events differently over time. Base statements can be misunderstood. Details can change. Investigators must examine not only what someone says, but also whether the information can be independently supported. The case against Hernandez would eventually revolve heavily around this question. Was his confession the missing piece of a decades-old mystery? Or was it an unreliable statement that could not prove guilt? When detectives interviewed Hernandez in 2012, authorities said he provided details about Etan's disappearance and admitted responsibility for the crime. The announcement stunned the public. For years, many people believed the case might never be solved. Now there was a possible explanation, a possible offender, a possible answer. But the emotional reaction was immediately followed by legal questions. A confession is powerful, but a confession must still be tested. In criminal cases, Prosecutors cannot rely only on public belief or emotional certainty. They must present evidence that meets the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The investigation now faced the challenge of transforming a decades-old confession into a courtroom case. Detectives continued examining Hernandez's background. They reviewed his connection to the neighborhood. They investigated whether his statements matched known facts from the original investigation. They searched for any additional evidence that could support the prosecution's theory. Every detail mattered. Because the case involved a crime from 1979, investigators had to overcome enormous obstacles. Many potential witnesses had moved away. Some had died. Memories had changed. The physical landscape of Soho had transformed. Buildings that existed in 1979 had different owners and purposes decades later. The world in which Eaton disappeared no longer existed exactly as it had before. Yet investigators continued. The importance of the case was impossible to ignore. For the Patz family, the news created a mixture of emotions. After more than 30 years, they finally had a name. They finally had someone accused of taking their son. But an accusation could not erase decades of pain. It could not restore the childhood Eaton never experienced. It could not answer every question that had haunted them. The family had spent years living between hope and grief. Now they faced another uncertain period, the wait for justice. The public reaction was equally intense. For many Americans, Eaton's disappearance had been one of the first missing child cases they ever followed. His image had been printed on posters and remembered through national awareness campaigns. People who were children themselves in 1979 had grown into adults while still remembering the unanswered question, what happened to Eaton? Now, the country waited for the legal system to determine whether the mystery had finally been solved. The case also reignited discussions about cold case investigations. For decades, some believed that old crimes became impossible to prosecute. The Hernandez arrest challenged that assumption. It demonstrated that cases could remain active even after many years. New information could emerge. Investigators could revisit old evidence. People connected to historic events could eventually come forward. But the case also highlighted the difficulties of solving crimes across generations. The passage of time can create as many problems as opportunities. A confession may exist, but can it be verified? A suspect may be identified, but can the evidence prove guilt? A family may believe they finally have answers, but can the court reach the same conclusion? These questions would dominate the next stage of the investigation. The prosecution prepared its case. The defense prepared its challenge. The courtroom would become the place where decades of uncertainty would be examined. Before that happened, however, investigators faced another challenge. They had to reconstruct a crime that had occurred when many modern forensic tools did not exist. In 1979, there was no DNA evidence connecting Hernandez to the scene. There was no video surveillance from the neighborhood. There was no digital trail. The case would depend heavily on testimony, investigative work, and the credibility of statements made decades later. That made the legal process especially complicated. Supporters of the prosecution argued that Hernandez's confession provided the answer that had eluded investigators for years. Critics questioned whether the confession alone was enough. The debate was not simply about one suspect. It was about how justice should handle cases where time has erased much of the original evidence. The Eaton Patz investigation became a major example of the challenges faced by modern cold case prosecutions. How much weight should be given to a confession made decades after a crime? How should Cortez evaluate statements that cannot be supported by traditional physical evidence? How can prosecutors prove a case when the investigation begins more than 30 years after the alleged crime? These questions would eventually be examined inside a courtroom. But before the trial began, the arrest itself marked a historic moment. A case that had shaped America's understanding of missing children was no longer only a story about loss. It was now a story about accountability. On the streets of Soho, where investigators had searched in 1979 and again in 2012, the memory of Eaton remained. The neighborhood had changed. The city had changed. But the mystery that began with a 6-year-old boy walking toward a school bus stop had never truly disappeared. Now, after 33 years of silence, the the investigation had found a possible answer. The world waited to see whether that answer would survive the most difficult test of all, a trial. Because finding a suspect is not the same as proving a crime. A confession is not the same as a conviction. And after decades of waiting, the final chapter of the Eaton Patz case would depend on whether the evidence could finally tell the complete story of what happened on that morning in May 1979. For more than 30 years, the disappearance of Eaton Patz remained suspended between two impossible realities. Everyone knew that something terrible had happened. A 6-year-old boy had left his home in Soho and never returned. But knowing that a tragedy occurred was not the same as knowing who was responsible. The investigation had spent decades searching for the missing piece that could transform suspicion into proof. In 2012, investigators believed they had finally found that missing piece. His name was Pedro Hernandez. But the path from a confession to a conviction would prove to be long, complicated, and filled with questions. The announcement of Hernandez's arrest created immediate shock across the United States. For many people, the name Eaton Patz was not just a criminal case. It was a memory. It was the photograph on missing child posters. It was the story parents told their children about safety. It was the unanswered question that had remained in the public consciousness for more than 3 decades. Now, suddenly, authorities were saying the mystery had a possible solution. According to prosecutors, Hernandez had admitted involvement in Eaton's disappearance during police questioning in 2012. Authorities said he described luring Eaton into a nearby location and killing him shortly after the child left home. The details of those statements became the foundation of the prosecution's case. But almost immediately, questions emerged. A confession can be one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in any criminal investigation. It can reveal information only the offender should know. It can provide a timeline. It can explain what happened when other evidence is missing. But confessions must also be examined carefully. The justice system requires more than an accusation. It requires proof. The defense would later challenge the reliability of Hernandez's statements, arguing that his confession was not supported by enough independent evidence and questioning the circumstances surrounding the interrogation. This debate became central to the case. How should investigators and courts evaluate a confession made more than 30 years after a crime? That question would follow the case from the investigation room into the courtroom. After Hernandez's arrest, detectives continued working to verify his statements. They examined his connection to the area where Eaton disappeared. They reviewed historical information. They looked for evidence that could confirm details from his confession. The challenge was enormous. The alleged crime had occurred in 1979. The neighborhood had changed. The people connected to the investigation had aged. Physical evidence from the original disappearance was extremely limited. Investigators had to reconstruct a moment from the past using information gathered decades later. The case became an example of the unique difficulties faced by cold case detectives. Time can reveal secrets, but time can also erase evidence. Buildings are renovated. Records are lost. Witnesses forget. People move away. The passage of years creates a gap between the event itself and the investigation trying to explain it. Yet cold case investigators are trained to search through that gap. They revisit old information. They compare statements. They look for inconsistencies. They examine whether new information changes the understanding of the original investigation. In the Eaton Patz case, the renewed investigation focused heavily on Hernandez's alleged statements and whether they matched known facts. One important factor was his connection to the Soho neighborhood. In 1979, Hernandez had been a teenager working in the area. According to authorities, he was present in the neighborhood around the time Eaton disappeared. That connection made him a person of interest decades later. But being in a location is not the same as committing a crime. Investigators needed more. They needed evidence linking Hernandez directly to Eaton's disappearance. The search for that evidence continued. Meanwhile, the public debate surrounding the case intensified. Some people saw the confession as the long-awaited answer. Others questioned whether a case without physical evidence could ever provide complete certainty. The situation reflected a broader issue in criminal justice. Not every case is solved in the same way. Some investigations are built around fingerprints, DNA, or video evidence. Others rely on witness testimony, investigative reconstruction, and admissions by the accused. Each case must be judged on the evidence available. For the Patz family, the legal arguments did not change the emotional reality. They had spent 33 years waiting for information. The announcement brought painful memories back into public view. The disappearance that had shaped their lives was once again dominating headlines. But now, there was a difference. There was a suspect. There was a legal process. There was a possibility of closure. However, closure would not come quickly. The first trial of Pedro Hernandez ended without a verdict in 2015. The jury could not reach a unanimous decision. After decades of waiting, the case had once again reached uncertainty. For prosecutors, the first trial had demonstrated the challenges of presenting a decades-old case. For the defense, the results showed that doubts remained. The confession had been powerful, but it had also been questioned. The legal system had not yet reached its final decision. A second trial was scheduled, and once again, prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared to present competing versions of what happened on May 25, SIL 1979. The prosecution argued that Hernandez's statements represented the truth finally emerging after years of silence. The defense argued that the evidence was insufficient and that the confession could not be trusted without stronger confirmation. The courtroom became the place where the mystery of Ethan Patz would be examined. Every detail would be questioned. Every statement would be analyzed. Every piece of evidence would be measured against the highest standard of American criminal law. Beyond the legal arguments, the case carried enormous emotional weight. The name Ethan Patz had represented an unanswered question for generations. Now, the trial represented a search for accountability. For detectives who had worked on the case over the decades, it represented the final test of years of effort. For prosecutors, it represented the challenge of proving a crime that had occurred nearly 40 years earlier. For the defense, it represented the responsibility to challenge evidence and protect the rights of the accused. And for the public, it represented a moment that many never expected to see. The Ethan Patz case was finally inside a courtroom. The mystery that began on a Manhattan street in 1979 had reached its most important stage. But the hardest question remained. Could a jury be convinced that the confession told the truth? Could decades of uncertainty finally be replaced by a legal conclusion? The answer would depend on the evidence, not the headlines, not public emotion, not the passage of time, only the facts presented in court. And after more than 3 decades of searching, the story of Ethan Patz was about to face its final and most difficult examination. After more than 3 decades of unanswered questions, the disappearance of Ethan Patz finally reached the place where every criminal investigation must ultimately be tested. The courtroom, the streets of Soho had been searched. The old leads had been reviewed. The memories of 1979 had been examined again and again. Now the fate of the case would depend on 12 jurors deciding whether the evidence presented by prosecutors proved who was responsible for the disappearance and death of a 6-year-old boy. The defendant was Pedro Hernandez. The case against him was built around a confession that authorities said he gave to investigators in 2012, more than 30 years after Ethan vanished. That confession became the central focus of the trial. It was the bridge connecting a decades-old mystery to a modern criminal prosecution. But a bridge built across 33 years carries enormous weight. The prosecution had to prove that Hernandez's statements were truthful. The defense had to convince jurors that reasonable doubt remained. The trial was not simply about what happened in 1979. It was about memory, evidence, human behavior, and the difficult question of whether justice can be achieved when so much time has passed. From the beginning, prosecutors presented the case as the solution to one of America's most famous cold cases. They argued that Hernandez had been connected to Ethan's disappearance from the beginning, but that the truth remained hidden until he finally admitted responsibility. They described the confession as the most important piece of evidence. According to prosecutors, Hernandez's statements contained details consistent with the known circumstances of Ethan's disappearance. They argued that the confession explained why Ethan vanished, how the crime occurred, and why the case remained unsolved for so long. For prosecutors, the explanation was simple. After decades of silence, the person responsible had finally revealed the truth. But the defense saw the case differently. The defense challenged the reliability of Hernandez's statements and questioned whether his confession could be considered trustworthy. They argued that there was no physical evidence directly connecting Hernandez to the crime. They emphasized the enormous passage of time and the lack of traditional forensic evidence that many jurors expect in a homicide case. The defense argued that the prosecution was asking jurors to accept a conclusion based primarily on a confession that came decades later. That argument became the central battle of the trial. How much weight should a confession receive when other evidence is limited? The courtroom examined every part of Hernandez's interaction with investigators. Jurors heard testimony about how detectives approached the case after the 2012 reopening. They heard about the information that led authorities to Hernandez. They heard about the interviews that followed. They examined the statements that prosecutors said represented an admission of guilt. The prosecution attempted to show that Hernandez's words were not random or unreliable. They argued that his statements matched important facts known about the disappearance. The defense attempted to create uncertainty. They argued that the confession was not supported by enough independent evidence. The trial also brought renewed attention to the emotional impact of Eaton's disappearance. Although the legal process focused on evidence, the human reality behind the case was impossible to ignore. Eaton had been 6 years old when he disappeared. His childhood ended that morning. His family spent decades living without answers. The courtroom became the place where those years of uncertainty were finally examined publicly. Family members listened as prosecutors described the events surrounding Eaton's disappearance. They heard details that had remained unknown for decades. They faced the painful reality that the child they had spent years searching for was believed to have been killed shortly after leaving home. For any family, such information would be devastating. For the Patz family, it came after decades of waiting. The trial also highlighted the challenges of prosecuting historical cases. Unlike recent crimes, cold cases often lack the evidence that investigators normally rely upon. Witnesses may no longer remember events clearly. Important locations may have changed. People involved may no longer be available. The passage of time creates uncertainty that both sides in a trial must confront. The Eaton Patz prosecution became a major example of these challenges. The case demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of reopening old investigations. Modern detectives could revisit forgotten cases. But solving those cases still required meeting the same legal standards applied to every criminal trial. The prosecution had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense had the right to challenge every piece of evidence. The jury had the responsibility of deciding what facts had been proven. His first trial ended in 2015 without a final answer. After weeks of testimony, jurors were unable to reach a unanimous decision. A mistrial was declared. For many people following the case, the result was shocking. After decades of waiting, there was still no verdict. The case had traveled from the streets of Manhattan to a courtroom, but uncertainty remained. For the Patz family, the mistrial meant continuing a journey they had already endured for more than 30 years. The possibility of justice was still there, but it had not yet arrived. The prosecution decided to move forward with a second trial. The legal battle was not over. The case would return to court. Once again, prosecutors would present their evidence. Once again, the defense would challenge it. Once again, jurors would be asked to determine whether the state had proven responsibility for one of the most famous child disappearances in American history. The second trial would carry the weight of everything that came before it. The years of searching, the failed leads, the public attention, the emotional impact, the first trial's uncertainty. Everything led to this moment. As the courtroom prepared for another examination of the evidence, the question remained exactly the same as it had on that morning in 1979. What happened to Eaton Patz? For 33 years, that question had haunted detectives, journalists, and the public. Now, it was placed before a jury. The answer would not come from headlines. It would not come from public opinion. It would come only from evidence presented under the rules of law. The second trial would determine whether the confession that reopened the case would finally close it. And after nearly 4 decades of waiting, The world was about to learn whether the disappearance that changed America would finally lead to a conviction. For nearly 40 years, the name Eitan Patz represented an unanswered question. A photograph of a smiling 6-year-old boy had become one of the most recognizable images in American missing child history. His disappearance had changed the way parents thought about safety. It had influenced national conversations about missing children. It had inspired new systems designed to protect families from experiencing the same nightmare. But for the Patz family, the case was never about history. It was never about statistics. It was never about national awareness. It was about one child, their son. And after decades of waiting, the final stage of the investigation had arrived. The second trial of Pedro Hernandez began with the same central question that had surrounded the case since 1979. Did the evidence prove that Hernandez was responsible for Eitan's disappearance and death? The prosecution believed it did. The defense argued it did not. Inside the courtroom, decades of investigation were reduced to testimony, evidence, and legal arguments. Every statement mattered. Every detail was examined. Every uncertainty was questioned. The prosecution presented Hernandez's confession as the heart of the case. They argued that after years of silence, Hernandez had finally revealed what happened on the morning Eitan disappeared. They told jurors that his statements provided the explanation investigators had searched for since 1979. According to prosecutors, Hernandez had been working in the Soho area as a teenager when Eitan disappeared. They argued that his connection to the neighborhood, combined with his statements to authorities decades later, established his responsibility. The defense approached the case from a different perspective. They did not deny that Eitan had disappeared. They did not deny the tragedy. But they challenged whether the prosecution had provided enough reliable evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They focused heavily on the confession. The defense argued that a statement made more than 3 decades after the alleged crime required careful examination. They questioned whether Hernandez's statements were accurate and whether they were supported by independent evidence. The jury had to decide which interpretation of the evidence was stronger. The trial also brought attention to the emotional consequences of the case. For the first time in decades, the details surrounding Eitan's disappearance were being publicly examined again. The courtroom became a place where the past returned. The morning of May 25th, still 1979. The streets of Soho. The unanswered questions. The pain carried by a family for generations. The legal process could not erase that pain, but it could determine responsibility. As testimony continued, prosecutors attempted to establish that Hernandez's confession was consistent with the known facts of the investigation. They argued that his statements were not simply a story created decades later. They presented them as the truth finally emerging. The defense continued challenging the prosecution's theory. They reminded jurors that criminal convictions cannot be based on emotion or public pressure. They argued that the evidence had to meet the strict standard required by law. The trial became a larger discussion about one of the most difficult issues in criminal justice. How do you prove a crime that happened almost 40 years earlier? Cold cases often depend on patience. They depend on preserved evidence. They depend on new technology. They depend on witnesses who are willing and able to provide information. But some cases reach court with significant gaps created by time. The Eitan Patz trial demonstrated those challenges clearly. The prosecution had a confession. The defense questioned its reliability. The jury had to evaluate everything presented and determine whether the case had reached the level of certainty required for a conviction. On February 14, still 2017, after the second trial concluded, the jury reached its decision. Pedro Hernandez was found guilty of kidnapping and murdering Eitan Patz. The verdict marked a historic moment. After nearly 4 decades, one of America's most famous missing child cases had reached a legal conclusion. For investigators who had worked on the case over generations, the verdict represented the result of years of persistence. For prosecutors, it represented a successful argument that the confession and other evidence proved responsibility. For the Patz family, it represented something far more personal. It represented an answer. But even after the conviction, the victory carried profound sadness. A guilty verdict could not bring Eitan back. It could not restore the years lost. It could not change the morning when a 6-year-old boy left home and never returned. Justice and grief existed together. The conviction also became part of a larger conversation about cold cases. The Eton Patz investigation showed that time does not always prevent justice. A case that seemed impossible to solve could still reach a courtroom decades later. But it also demonstrated the importance of evidence preservation and careful investigation. Without records, without determination, without investigators willing to revisit the past, the case may have remained unresolved forever. The verdict brought an official conclusion to the legal process, but questions about the investigation remain topics of discussion. Cold cases often leave behind complicated histories, different theories, different interpretations, different perspectives. But the court's decision established the legal outcome. Pedro Hernandez was convicted. The responsibility for Eton's death was determined through the criminal justice system. The case that had begun with a child walking toward a school bus stop had finally reached its conclusion in a courtroom nearly 4 decades later. Yet the story of Eton Patz was never only about the person convicted. It was also about the impact of the disappearance itself. The case changed America. It changed how missing children were viewed. It changed how parents approached child safety. It changed how law enforcement agencies responded to reports of missing children. The image of Eton became connected to a national movement determined to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. The tragedy of one child created awareness that affected millions. That is one of the most complex legacies of the case. A painful event created lasting change. A family's suffering became a reason for society to improve. The conviction of Pedro Hernandez closed one chapter, but the legacy of Eton Patz continued. His name remained connected to the evolution of missing child investigations. His disappearance remained a reminder that every missing child represents a family waiting for answers. And his story remained a powerful example of how long the search for justice can take. For nearly 40 years, the question had followed America. Where was Eton? Who was responsible? Could the truth ever be known? In 2017, the legal system finally provided its answer. But the emotional impact of the case reached far beyond the courtroom. Because behind every headline was a child whose life mattered. Behind every investigation was a family who never stopped remembering. And behind every cold case was the possibility that even after decades of silence, the truth could still be found. The conviction of Pedro Hernandez in 2017 brought a legal conclusion to one of the longest and most closely followed missing child cases in American history. After nearly 40 years of uncertainty, a jury had reached a decision. The man prosecutors said was responsible for the disappearance and death of 6-year-old Eton Patz had been found guilty. For many people who had followed the case since 1979, the verdict represented a moment they never thought they would see. A mystery that had lasted for generations finally had a legal answer. But inside the courtroom, outside the headlines, and within the Patz family, the emotions were far more complicated. Because justice does not erase loss. A conviction cannot return a child. It cannot restore birthdays that were never celebrated. It cannot replace the years a family spent waiting beside a telephone, hoping for news that never came. The verdict answered one question, but it could never change the fact that Eton Patz was gone. After the guilty verdict, the case moved into another important stage, the sentencing of Pedro Hernandez. The sentencing hearing allowed the court to consider the consequences of the conviction and formally determine the punishment. It also gave those closest to Eton an opportunity to speak about the impact of the crime. For decades, Eton's disappearance had been discussed through investigations, news reports, and legal arguments. But behind every document and every courtroom statement was a human story. A child, a family, a community. The sentencing process brought that reality back into focus. Eton had been 6 years old when he disappeared. He was not simply a name in a police file. He was a son, a brother, a child with a future that was taken away. The impact of his disappearance extended far beyond the Patz household. It affected neighbors who searched for him in 1979. It affected investigators who spent years trying to understand what happened. It affected parents across America who saw his photograph and imagined the unimaginable possibility of losing their own child. The case had become part of the national memory. At the sentencing, the court recognized the seriousness of the crime and the decades of pain experienced by Eaton's family. Pedro Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The sentence marked the final legal step in the prosecution. But for the Pat's family, there was no simple ending. For nearly 4 decades, their lives had been shaped by uncertainty. The disappearance created a permanent absence. The conviction created accountability. But accountability and healing are not the same thing. The story of Eaton Patz also revealed something important about the nature of long-term investigations. Cold cases are often described as puzzles waiting to be solved. But they are more than puzzles. They involve real people whose lives continue while the investigation remains unfinished. Families age. Children grow up. Communities change. The world moves forward. But the unanswered question remains. For the Patz family, every year without answers represented another year carrying a burden that few people could understand. The conviction finally removed one uncertainty. They knew who the justice system held responsible. But many memories of Eaton remained connected to the morning when he disappeared. The blue cap. The short walk. The expectation that he would return home. The ordinary routine that became an extraordinary tragedy. The case also continued to raise important discussions about the investigation of historical crimes. The successful prosecution demonstrated that cold cases can be solved even after decades. But it also highlighted the importance of careful investigation. The passage of time creates challenges that cannot be ignored. Evidence must be preserved. Records must be maintained. Investigators must continue looking for new methods. The Eaton Patz case became one of many examples showing why unsolved cases should not simply be forgotten. Every year, law enforcement agencies revisit old investigations. Sometimes new technology provides answers. Sometimes new witnesses come forward. Sometimes information that once seemed insignificant becomes important years later. The lesson from cases like Eaton's is clear. Time does not always destroy the possibility of justice. Sometimes it creates the opportunity for it. The case also changed the way America understood missing children. When Eaton disappeared in 1979, the response to missing child cases was very different from today. There were fewer coordinated resources, less public awareness, limited national communication between agencies. The attention generated by Eaton's disappearance helped push society toward change. His case became one of the tragedies that contributed to a national movement focused on protecting children and improving responses to missing person investigations. The creation of National Missing Children's Day on May 25th became one of the most visible reminders of that impact. Every year, the date carries 2 meanings. It represents awareness for missing children across the country, and it represents the memory of a 6-year-old boy whose disappearance changed America. For many people, Eaton became a symbol. But for his family, he was always more than a symbol. Symbols represent ideas. Children represent lives. That distinction is one of the most important lessons from the case. Behind every missing child poster is a person. Behind every investigation file is a family. Behind every headline is a story that continues long after the cameras leave. The conviction of Pedro Hernandez closed a legal chapter. But the legacy of Eaton Patz continued through the changes his case helped inspire. Parents became more aware. Communities became more prepared. Law enforcement agencies developed stronger systems. The tragedy became part of a larger effort to protect other children. In that sense, Eaton's story continued to influence the world long after the courtroom proceedings ended. His disappearance forced America to confront difficult questions. How do we respond when a child goes missing? How do we support families living through uncertainty? How do we ensure that no child becomes forgotten? The answers to those questions shaped decades of progress. The case also demonstrated the importance of never giving up on unresolved investigations. When Eaton disappeared, many people feared the truth might never be known. For years, that fear seemed justified. But investigators continued. Families continued searching. The case remained alive. And eventually, after nearly 4 decades, it reached a conclusion. Not because the mystery solved itself, not because time made the answer easier, but because people continued looking. That may be the most important legacy of the Eaton Pats investigation. Persistence matters. Evidence matters. Memory matters. The search for justice can take years, sometimes generations. But every effort contributes to the possibility that one day, an unanswered question will finally receive an answer. The story of Eaton Pats began with an ordinary morning in New York City. A child leaving home. A short walk. A routine moment. It ended decades later in a courtroom where justice was finally delivered. But the impact of his story remains much larger than one verdict. Because Eaton was not only the boy who disappeared, he became the child America never forgot. And his name continues to remind the world of a simple but powerful truth. Every child matters. Every family deserves answers. And every unanswered case deserves the chance to be solved. The story of Eaton Pats began with a disappearance, but it became something much larger than one investigation. Long before a courtroom verdict, before a suspect was identified, before decades of unanswered questions finally reached a legal conclusion, Eaton's name had already changed the way America viewed missing children. His case became a turning point. A moment when a private family tragedy became a national awakening. In 1979, when 6-year-old Eaton vanished from his Soho neighborhood, the United States did not have the systems that exist today for responding to missing children. There was no instant nationwide communication network connecting police departments. There were no digital databases allowing investigators to compare cases across jurisdictions. There was no modern public understanding of how quickly a missing child investigation could become a race against time. The disappearance of Eaton Pats exposed those weaknesses. It forced communities, lawmakers, and law enforcement agencies to confront a frightening reality. A child could disappear in an ordinary moment. A family could search desperately for answers. And without coordination, technology, and public awareness, valuable time could be lost. Eaton's face became one of the first missing child images to receive widespread national attention. His photograph appeared in newspapers, on television, and on missing person materials distributed across the country. Millions of Americans saw the face of a child they had never met but felt they somehow knew. That visibility changed public awareness forever. Before Eaton's case, many families believed missing children's cases were isolated tragedies. They happened somewhere else, to someone else. But Eaton's disappearance brought the issue into living rooms across America. Parents began asking different questions. How do we keep our children safe? How quickly should we react if a child disappears? Who should be contacted? What systems exist to help? The answers to those questions eventually influenced major changes in American child protection efforts. The case became part of a broader movement demanding stronger resources for missing children and better cooperation between agencies. Organizations dedicated to assisting missing children gained greater attention. Law enforcement departments began developing more specialized approaches. The country began moving toward a new understanding. A missing child is not just a local matter. A missing child is a national concern. One of the most visible reminders of Eaton's impact came in 1983, when May 25th, the anniversary of his disappearance, was designated National Missing Children's Day. The date became an annual opportunity to remember missing children across the United States and highlight efforts to locate them and prevent future disappearances. For many Americans, May 25th became a date associated with awareness. For the Pats family, it remained the day their lives changed forever. That contrast defined much of Eaton's legacy. To the public, he became a symbol. To his family, he was always a person. A child with a personality. A son with dreams. A brother. A member of a family whose future changed in a single morning. The difference between those two perspectives is important. Public symbols often represent ideas. But behind every symbol is a real human life. The case of Eaton Pats reminded America that missing child investigations are not only about solving crimes, they are about protecting memories, preserving hope, supporting families, and ensuring that no child becomes only a name in an old file. The investigation also changed how law enforcement approached cold cases. For decades, the disappearance of Eaton remained unresolved. Many investigators worked on the case over different periods. Some searched the original evidence. Some followed new information. Some reviewed old leads with new technology. The case demonstrated that investigations do not belong to only one moment in time. A detective working decades later may solve a mystery that began before they entered law enforcement. That possibility became increasingly important as forensic science advanced. The growth of DNA technology, improved databases, and modern investigative methods created new opportunities for cases that once seemed impossible. Across the country, old investigations began receiving renewed attention. Evidence that had been stored for years could now be examined in ways investigators from previous generations never imagined. The Eton Patz case became part of that larger transformation. It showed that time does not always erase the possibility of justice. Sometimes, time creates the opportunity for new answers. However, the case also revealed that technology alone cannot solve every mystery. Behind every breakthrough are people. Investigators who continue searching. Families who continue asking questions. Communities that refuse to forget. The eventual resolution of the Eton Patz case was not the result of one single moment. It came from decades of work. From the original detectives who documented the investigation. From later investigators who reviewed old information. From prosecutors who presented the case in court. From a family that continued carrying Eton's memory. Every generation contributed something. That is one of the most important lessons from the investigation. Old cases are often solved through persistence across time. One person begins the search. Another person continues it. Eventually, someone finds the answer. The case also influenced how parents thought about independence and childhood. In 1979, many children commonly walked short distances alone. Neighborhoods often operated with a different sense of familiarity. After Eton disappeared, many families changed their routines. Parents became more cautious. Communities increased awareness. The idea of child safety became a larger part of everyday conversations. The disappearance of one child changed the childhood experiences of millions of others. Yet even with all the changes inspired by the case, one fact remained painful. No reform could undo what happened to Eton. No law could restore the years lost. No national program could remove the grief carried by his family. The purpose of remembering Eton's story is not only to recognize the changes that followed. It is also to remember the child at the center of those changes. A 6-year-old boy who left home expecting to return. A child whose life was interrupted before he had the chance to grow up. A family whose search became a decades-long journey. The conviction of Pedro Hernandez provided a legal conclusion, but the impact of Eton's story continued beyond the courtroom. His case became part of the history of American criminal justice. It became part of the history of child protection. It became part of the history of how society responds when a child disappears. The most powerful legacy of the investigation may be the idea that every missing child deserves attention. Every family deserves support. Every unanswered question deserves to be taken seriously. Because the passage of time does not make a child less important. It does not make a family's pain disappear. And it does not eliminate the responsibility to search for truth. More than 4 decades after Eton vanished, his name remains remembered not only because of the tragedy that occurred, but because of the changes his story inspired. The little boy who disappeared on a Manhattan street became a symbol of determination. A reminder that investigations can continue. That answers can emerge years later. That justice can arrive even after unimaginable delays. But above all, Eton's story remains a reminder that behind every case number, every headline, and every investigation file is a human being whose life mattered. A child, a family, a memory that refused to disappear, and a morning in New York City that changed America forever. For more than 4 decades, the name Eton Patz has been connected to one of the most famous missing child cases in American history. His photograph became recognized across the country. His disappearance became a landmark investigation. His case became a symbol of change, awareness, and the enduring search for justice. But behind every headline, every courtroom argument, and every national conversation was something much more personal. A child, a family, a life interrupted. Before Eton became known as the missing boy from Soho, he was simply Eton, a 6-year-old growing up in New York City, A child with a family, a personality, and a future that had not yet been written. The investigation that followed his disappearance would eventually influence millions of people. But the story began with one family trying to understand how an ordinary morning had become an unimaginable tragedy. That human side of the case remained at the center for decades. The world saw a photograph. The Patz family remembered a son. That distinction shaped everything that followed. When Eaton disappeared on May 25th, SIL 1979, the immediate focus was finding him. The first hours were filled with urgency. The first days were filled with searches. The first months were filled with questions. But as years passed, the nature of the search changed. The hope of immediate discovery became the determination to preserve his memory. The investigation became a long-term pursuit of truth. The Patz family lived through a reality shared by many families of missing children, the painful space between knowing and not knowing. Not knowing where a loved one is. Not knowing what happened. Not knowing whether answers will ever come. That uncertainty can become its own form of suffering. For decades, the family carried that burden while the rest of the world slowly moved forward. But they did not allow Eaton's name to disappear. They continued remembering him. They continued supporting efforts to help missing children. They continued believing that the truth mattered. Their persistence became one of the most powerful aspects of the case. Cold cases often survive because someone refuses to let them become forgotten. In the Eaton-Patz investigation, that refusal came from many places. From family members, from investigators, from advocates, from people across the country who saw his photograph and believed that every missing child deserved attention. The case also revealed something important about public memory. A crime can become famous. A case can become historic. A name can become recognized worldwide. But fame does not reduce the pain experienced by those closest to the victim. For the Patz family, media attention brought both awareness and difficulty. Every report kept Eaton's story alive. But every report also reopened the wound. Every anniversary brought renewed attention. But every anniversary also marked another year without him. The public often views investigations as stories with beginnings and endings. A disappearance, a search, an arrest, a trial, a verdict. But for families, the experience is not so simple. The investigation may end. The grief does not. That reality became one of the lasting lessons of the Eaton-Patz case. Justice is essential, but justice exists alongside memory. The conviction of Pedro Hernandez provided accountability according to the legal system, but it did not erase the decades that had passed. It did not restore the childhood Eaton never experienced. It did not remove the questions that surrounded the family for so long. Instead, it provided something different. A conclusion. A recognition that what happened to Eaton mattered. A recognition that his life was important. The case also became a reminder of the importance of victims in criminal investigations. Over time, investigations can become focused on suspects, evidence, and legal strategy. Those elements are necessary, but at the center is always a person, a life, a story. In Eaton's case, remembering the child behind the headlines became essential, because the significance of the investigation was not only that it solved a mystery, it was that it honored a child whose disappearance changed the world around him. The impact of Eaton's case extended beyond New York. Across the United States, parents became more aware of child safety. Communities became more organized. Law enforcement agencies improved communication and response systems. The case contributed to a national movement focused on protecting children. But those changes were never the reason Eaton's life mattered. His life mattered because he existed, because he was loved, because he was a child with an entire future ahead of him. That is the message that remains strongest decades later. Behind every missing person, case is someone whose absence affects real people. Behind every investigation file is a family waiting. Behind every photograph is a person who should be remembered as more than the circumstances of their disappearance. The story of Eaton-Patz continues to be discussed because it changed history. But history is only part of the story. The deeper meaning comes from understanding what was lost. A childhood, a future, a family's ordinary life. The morning of May 25th, Sill 1979, began like countless other mornings. A child preparing for school. A parent watching him leave. A normal routine. No one knew that those ordinary moments would become permanently remembered. No one knew that the name Eitan Patz would become connected to national change. No one knew that the search for answers would continue for nearly 40 years. That is what makes the case so powerful. It was not extraordinary because of where it happened. It was extraordinary because of how ordinary it began. A normal street. A normal neighborhood. A normal school morning. Until it was not. The passage of time transformed the investigation into history, but the emotional truth remained unchanged. A family lost a child. A community lost its sense of security. A nation learned difficult lessons. And one boy became the reason millions of people began paying closer attention to the safety of children. Today, when people remember Eitan Patz, they often remember the photograph that became famous. They remember the investigation. They remember the courtroom. They remember the changes that followed. But the most important thing to remember is that before he became a symbol, Eitan was a child. The case was never only about a mystery. It was about a life. And that life continues to be remembered. The story of Eitan Patz stands as a reminder that time may pass, cities may change, and investigations may eventually conclude, but the importance of a person's life does not fade. Some names remain because of tragedy. Others remain because they inspire change. Eitan's name remains because it represents both, a reminder of what was lost, and a reminder of what society learned. A reminder that every child matters. Every family deserves answers. And every story deserves to be remembered with humanity, not only with headlines. On a spring morning in 1979, a 6-year-old boy walked out of his family's apartment in Soho, New York, expecting nothing more than an ordinary day. He carried his lunch. He prepared for school. He stepped into a neighborhood that his family knew well. It was a moment that should have disappeared into the countless routines of childhood. Instead, it became one of the most unforgettable moments in American criminal history. The name was Eitan Patz. For decades, his disappearance represented one of the most painful mysteries in the United States. A child vanished during a short walk to a school bus stop. A family waited for answers. Investigators searched through years of uncertainty. A nation watched as the case became a symbol of fear, determination, and the search for justice. But the story of Eitan Patz was never only about the day he disappeared. It was about everything that followed. The investigation, the questions, the changes, the people who refused to forget, and the truth that eventually emerged after more than 4 decades. The case began at a time when the world of criminal investigation looked very different. Technology that seems essential today did not exist. Communication between agencies was slower. Missing child resources were limited. Investigators relied heavily on interviews, physical searches, and traditional detective work. The disappearance of Eitan exposed the weaknesses of that system. But it also became a catalyst for change. The search for one child helped create a greater national awareness of the thousands of families facing similar nightmares. Eitan's photograph became one of the first missing child images to capture nationwide attention. His face appeared in newspapers and public awareness campaigns. Millions of people who never knew him personally became familiar with his name. The image represented a painful question. How could a child disappear without answers? That question remained for years. The investigation continued through different generations of detectives. Some investigators worked the case when Eitan first vanished. Others inherited it decades later. Each generation faced the same challenge: find the truth. The case became a powerful example of the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining investigative records. Without the work of earlier investigators, future detectives might not have had the foundation needed to revisit the disappearance. Cold cases are rarely solved by one person. They are solved through persistence, through patience, through the combined efforts of people who may never see the final results of their work. The Eitan Patz investigation demonstrated that principle clearly. For decades, the case remained unresolved. Suspects were considered. Leads were examined. Theories were explored. But certainty remained impossible. Then, more than 30 years after Eitan disappeared, the investigation entered a new chapter. In 2012, authorities arrested Pedro Hernandez after renewed investigation brought him to the center of the case. According to prosecutors, Hernandez confessed to killing Ethan after luring him into a location near the child's route. The arrest shocked the nation. A case many believed would never be solved suddenly had a suspect. But the legal process still had to determine the truth. The confession became the central issue. Prosecutors argued that Hernandez's statements finally explained what happened in 1979. The defense questioned the reliability of those statements and challenged whether the evidence was sufficient. The case went through a difficult legal process. The first trial ended without a verdict when the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. But the investigation continued. A second trial followed. And in 2017, Pedro Hernandez was convicted of kidnapping and murdering Ethan Patz. The verdict brought a legal conclusion to a case that had remained open for nearly 40 years. For many people, it represented a moment of justice. For the Patz family, it represented something deeply personal, an answer after decades of uncertainty. But even the conclusion of the case could not erase the tragedy. A conviction cannot return the years lost. It cannot restore the childhood that never happened. It cannot undo the pain carried by a family for generations. Justice can provide accountability, but memory remains. And that is perhaps the greatest lesson of the Ethan Patz case. A criminal investigation may end. A courtroom may reach a verdict. But the human impact continues. The story of Ethan changed America because it forced society to look differently at missing children. It changed how parents thought about safety. It changed how communities responded. It contributed to improvements in how missing child cases were recognized and investigated. The case helped create a stronger understanding that every missing child deserves immediate attention. Every family deserves support. Every unanswered question deserves to be taken seriously. The legacy of Ethan Patz is not only found in the investigation, it is found in the changes inspired by it. It is found in the awareness created. It is found in the lives potentially protected because society learned from one terrible morning in New York. But perhaps the most important part of remembering Ethan is remembering the child himself. Before the headlines, before the investigation, before the courtroom, there was simply Ethan, a 6-year-old boy, a son, a brother, a child whose life mattered. That is the part of the story that must never be lost. Because cases can become famous, investigations can become historic, but every victim remains a person first. The disappearance of Ethan Patz began as a tragedy. It became a national conversation. It became a landmark investigation. And eventually, it became a case that demonstrated how justice can survive the passage of time. More than 40 years later, the streets of Soho continue to change. New businesses open. New residents arrive. The city moves forward. But one morning remains frozen in history. May 25th, Sill, 1979. The morning when a child left home and never returned. The morning when a family entered a search that would last decades. The morning when America began to understand the importance of protecting its children in a new way. The morning that changed New York forever. The story of Ethan Patz remains a reminder that truth can take years to emerge. That investigations can continue across generations. That evidence, determination, and persistence can overcome enormous obstacles. And above all, it remains a reminder that behind every cold case is not just an investigation. There is a life. There is a family. There is a story that deserves to be remembered. Ethan Patz was a child who disappeared, but he was also a child who changed the world around him. His name became connected to hope. His story became connected to change. And his memory continues to carry one powerful message. No child should ever be forgotten. No family should ever be left without answers. And no search for justice should ever be abandoned.